Jesse Woodson James was born in Clay County, Missouri on September 5th, 1847. His father, Robert, was a hemp farmer by trade, in addition to being a Baptist minister. But I suppose being a man of the cloth don't necessarily make you immune to gold fever. And when gold was discovered in California, Robert headed west, alone, leaving his wife Zerelda and 3 young children behind in Missouri. And just 5 months later, Reverend James was dead. To quote historian T.J. Stiles, there would be no funeral, no burial, and no headstone. Robert had met his end in the California goldfields from cholera in September of 1850. Now, obviously, this was a devastating loss for the James family, but Robert's widow, Zerelda, was nothing if not resilient. Described by various sources as courageous, shrewd, and remarkable, the nearly 6-foot-tall Zerelda had a devotion to her children that bordered on the ferocious. But be that as it may, things would get worse before they started getting better. Shortly after Robert's death, many of the James family belongings were auctioned off to pay his debts. And by April of 1851, things had gotten so bad that Zerelda was taking a collection at her late husband's church just to keep the children fed. She would eventually remarry, though, to a farmer twice her age named Benjamin Sims, almost certainly a marriage of convenience. Jesse and the other kids weren't even allowed to live on the Sims farm. They stayed with a friend of their dearly departed fathers until the newlyweds separated that following June. Sims would be dead in another 6 months, and a little over a year after that, Zerelda tied the knot for the third and final time, swapping nuptials with a doctor by the name of Reuben Samuel. And make no mistake about it, Zerelda was definitely the one wearing the pants. Hell, she even made Reuben quit medicine so he could work the farm on a full-time basis. And for a while at least, life on the farm was good. Well, for everyone other than the slaves, that is. Neighbors would gather periodically to slaughter animals, meat was cured and smoked, fruit was jarred, and all the other little chores that come with country living. Jesse's mama and stepdaddy would welcome a baby girl in 1858 they named Sarah, and in time they'd add 3 more, John, Fanny, and Archie. By 1860, according to the federal census, a 12-year-old Jesse was attending school with his older brother Frank and little sister Susan. I don't think any of them could have predicted the change that was coming, not just for them, but the nation at large. And by change, of course, I do mean the Civil War. Long story short, Missouri was a border state. It was also very divided when it came to the issues of slavery and secession. You know the old trope about the Civil War being brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor? Well, that rings especially true for Missouri. By the year 1860, its population had exploded to around 1 million people, roughly 10% of whom were slaves. By contrast, in the deep southern states like Louisiana and Georgia, slaves made up closer to around 45% of the population. So yeah, Missouri was a slave state, but it wasn't quite as entrenched in slavery as other areas. And while around 40,000 Missourians would end up serving in the Confederate Army, over 100,000 more fought for the North. As for the James family, they were ardent supporters of the Southern cause. Not only did they themselves own slaves, but the area where they lived was known as Little Dixie. Now, if you listen to the recent episode I did on Silas Soul, you're already pretty familiar with the strife that plagued Missouri and Kansas in the years leading up to the war. I won't repeat myself too much here, but long story short, both pro- and anti-slavery factions flocked to the area looking to sway public sentiment. And in time, these factions would resort to violence. For the most part, though, none of this had a direct impact on the James family. Leastways not till the war officially began in April of 1861. Jesse's older brother Frank would answer the call a month later when he enlisted with the Missouri State Guard under Sterling Price. And by that August, Frank was already engaged in Yankee troops at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He also came down with a pretty serious case of the measles. And when General Price pulled his men out of Springfield, they were forced to leave the ailing Frank behind. He was taken prisoner, but released shortly thereafter and sent home, after pinky swearing to be a good boy. And home is where he stayed until May of 1863, when he once more took up the fight, this time with William Quantrill and his merry band of bushwhackers. Don't worry, we will get back to Jesse James here shortly, I promise. I'm just setting the stage right now. Little history foreplay, if you will, just to put everything in context and get your juices flowing. Now, speaking of William Quantrill, I am planning on doing a series on him in the very near future, but if you don't mind, I would like to give a quick overview. Born in Ohio in 1837, Quantrill, believe it or not, was a school teacher. At least he was until he killed a man in 1856. By the following year, Quantrill was living in Kansas, and later still, he'd sign on as a teamster for the Army, traveling as far west as Salt Lake City. But by 1859, he was right back in Kansas. Interestingly enough, Quantrill had previously been opposed to slavery. He was even an ardent admirer of the abolitionist James Lane. However, by 1860, things were changing. Quantrill started going by the alias of Charlie Hart and hanging out with border ruffians, stealing livestock and helping to chase down escaped slaves. When the Civil War kicked off, he headed to Texas, but soon lit out for the Cherokee Nation. It's there where Quantrill befriended Joel Mays, captain of the Confederate Cherokees under General Stan Wadey. And when the Cherokees rode east into Missouri, Quantrill was right there with them, soaking up all he could learn about the fine art of guerrilla warfare. Finally, in late 1861, he formed his own company of irregulars known as Quantrill's Raiders, which included such luminaries as George Todd and Bloody Bill Anderson. This wasn't the only group of bushwhackers there in Missouri, but they would become the most well-known. Under Quantrill's command, the Raiders fought more like the indigenous than regular soldiers, striking hard and fast and then dispersing into smaller groups to evade capture, oftentimes donning the blue uniforms of their vanquished foes in the process. And as the war progressed, the behavior of these guerrillas grew more and more savage. Murder was the norm. Prisoners were rarely taken, and the dead were oftentimes mutilated. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's this same band of cutthroats who took in Frank James in the spring of 1863. Now, as to why Frank decided to join the Raiders as opposed to the actual Confederate Army, we really don't know. There are stories of him being mistreated and arrested by the Missouri Provisional Militia. Maybe that's what inspired him. Or perhaps Frank just felt more comfortable riding with folks he was familiar with. Whatever the case, on May 19, 1863, Frank would assist Quantrill in attacking the U.S. troops garrisoned at Missouri City. Those who surrendered were executed, after which Frank and his fellow bushwhackers looted the town. From there, they continued raiding throughout Clay County, robbing and killing those who they suspected as being Union sympathizers. And yeah, this is the same Clay County where Frank was born and raised. Remember what I said earlier about the war there in Missouri being neighbor against neighbor. Some of the very same people that Frank was helping to kill, he had known for pretty much his entire life. And by late May of that same year, Frank and his compadres were camped out right there on the James farm, which, as it turns out, was probably not the greatest of ideas. A provisional militia out of nearby Clinton County soon caught wind and came a-calling. When they failed to locate Frank, they took the then 15-year-old Jesse James hostage. Legend has it that they beat him, possibly going so far as poking at him with their sabers. And while Jesse remained strong and refused to divulge his brother's whereabouts, the same cannot be said for his stepfather, Reuben Samuel. The provisionals ended up placing a noose around Reuben's neck and jerking him up into the air. After several minutes of torture, he finally broke and led him through the woods to where Frank and the others were camped. There was a brief firefight. Some of the guerrillas were killed, but luckily for Frank, he was able to escape. Reuben and Zerelda were then hauled to the district headquarters over in St. Joseph, while Jesse was left on the farm to look after his younger siblings. Meanwhile, Frank and the bushwhackers took their frustrations out on the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, this was partly in retaliation for what had just recently occurred in Kansas City. The family members of several suspected bushwhackers were arrested and being held there in an old building. And when the building tragically collapsed, people died. Among the dead were two of Bill Anderson's sisters, as well as a female cousin of another guerrilla you'll end up hearing much more about here shortly, named Cole Younger. It was almost certainly a total accident, but nevertheless, the guerrillas were looking for retribution. Also, Lawrence was sort of the de facto Jayhawker capital there in Kansas, in addition to being home of Quantrill's former mentor and current enemy, James Lane. Shortly before the attack, Quantrill ordered his men to, quote, kill, and you will make no mistake. Lawrence should be thoroughly cleansed, and the only way to cleanse it is to kill. And yeah, kill they did. Pretty much every single man and boy they could find. Those hiding were dragged out of their holes and executed. Some were shot, some stabbed, and others simply clubbed to death. Per a Lawrence resident, quote, the horsemanship of the guerrillas was perfect. They rode with that ease and abandon which are acquired by a life spent in the saddle amid desperate scenes. Their horses scarcely seemed to touch the ground, and the riders set upon them with bodies erect and arms perfectly free, with revolvers at full cock, shooting at every house and man they passed, and yelling like demons at every bound. On each side of this stream of fire were men fallen dead and wounded, and women and children, half-dressed, running and screaming, some trying to escape from danger, and some rushing to the side of their murdered friends. All total, Frank and the Raiders killed around 200 people, the vast majority of whom were non-combatants. People that had nothing to do with that building collapse over there in Kansas City. These were just normal, everyday people just trying to live their lives. Cole Younger would later aptly describe it as a day of butchery. Now, if you're looking for a pretty decent portrayal of the Lawrence Massacre, I'd strongly suggest checking out Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire. Yeah, Spider-Man. But don't worry, it is a way underrated movie that, in my opinion, gives a pretty realistic picture of the Missouri Bushwhackers. It also has Jewel, so hey, win-win. Now, later on that winter, Frank would join Quantrill down in Texas. He and his buddies wouldn't return to Missouri until the following spring, and it's at that point that the now 16-year-old Jesse James got his big chance. In his book Jesse James, The Last Rebel, T.J. Stiles summed it up best when he wrote, quote, "It was a savage set of men who returned with Frank that April. Already hardened by war, they had been blistered by butchery at Lawrence and debauchery in Texas. And Charles Fletcher Taylor, the man who led the small squad that crossed over to Clay County, was one of the hardest. Short, broad-shouldered, sporting a neatly trimmed mustache and beard, Fletch had fought with Quantrill since the beginning, scouting out Lawrence before the raid, murdering the innocent in its streets, and then riding to Texas. But there he turned against his master, murdering a Confederate officer and resisting Quantrill's attempt to arrest him. Now he fought on his own hook. Cantering beside him was an even smaller, even more vicious killer, little Archie Clement, a gray-eyed 18-year-old from Johnson County. Barely 5 feet tall, he looked more like a jockey than a guerrilla, but he was already an experienced gunman, and he would soon win the lasting admiration of Frank's little brother. These were the men who brought Jesse James to manhood." End of quote, and well said, Mr. Stiles. Now, starting in early June, Fletcher led the guerrillas, Jesse James included, throughout Clay County, killing Union loyalists, or just those who they suspected of being loyalists. Their first victim was an old boy named Bradley Bond. They rode up to his farm, asked to see the man in the house, and when Bradley stepped outside, they shot him dead. The next morning, they likewise killed a neighboring farmer named Alvis Dagley. Both of these guys, by the way, Dagley and Bond, were thought to have been part of that militia that beat Jesse and put the noose around his stepfather's neck. If true, I do think there's a good chance that one of these men may have been Jesse's first kill. Over the course of the next couple weeks, they'd kill at least 8 more Union sympathizers. Property was stolen and or destroyed, and on at least one occasion, they shot one of their victims' slaves just for the fun of it. And yeah, this was basically Jesse's introduction to war. Not as a soldier on the battlefield, but as a member of what can best be described as a death squad, just slowly picking off men that he and Frank had previously considered to be neighbors. Hell, it wasn't until they killed fellow Clay County resident Solomon Bigelow that Jesse even experienced being shot at. A brief skirmish that resulted in Bigelow's death, and Jesse getting the tip of his left index finger shot plumb off. The following day, they murdered a civilian they encountered on the road, just on suspicion that he was a Unionist. And on and on and on it went. A lot of killing going on in Missouri during the 1860s. I keep wanting to say Missouri, but I think that's because I watched too much Outlaw Josie Wells, so I'm going to stick with Missouri. Okay, by mid-July of 1864, a former militiaman would write that a, quote, "general terror prevails. Today there is not in the county of Clay one unconditional, loyal Union man who dare goes into the harvest field to do a day's work. Many of them have left the state. All are now talking of going." A week later, on the 20th, around 1,500 locals met in the town of Liberty to further condemn the bushwhackers. Quote, "Guerrillas, whatever the name they assume, and bushwhackers are the ravenous monsters of society, and their speedy and utter extermination should be sought by all brave and honorable men." End of quote. Now, I bring this up just to show that not everybody there in Missouri were fans of the Bushwhackers, even in Little Dixie. The majority may have supported them, but certainly not everybody. Hell, like I keep saying, up till this point, the only people that Jesse had been killing were his own damn neighbors. That would change a few weeks later, though, when the gang headed west into Platte County and attacked the town of Parkville. This was followed on July 10th by a similar assault on Platte City. If you've ever seen that photo of a young Jesse James, where he looks like he's about 12 years old, revolver in hand, and 2 more stuffed in his belt, that photograph was taken right there in Platte City. And Jesse, still 2 months shy of his 17th birthday, already had the dead eyes of a stone-cold killer. Once the Bushwhackers were done looting Platte, they rode north and murdered a minister who just so happened to be anti-slavery. This was followed by Jesse and Archie Clement allegedly gunning down a pair of Union men they caught picking apples. As you can imagine, things were getting a little hot there in Clay County, as evidenced by around 500 Union troops arriving looking to clean house. And that being the case, the guerrillas wisely chose to split up and scatter to the wind. The damage was already done, though. They had either killed or ran off most of the families in the area still loyal to the North. Those who remained either supported the Confederates or knew how to keep their mouths shut. This is also around the same period that Jesse and Frank joined up with Bloody Bill Anderson. I'm not going to lie, it's kind of hard to keep up with a lot of these names. Remember, Frank initially rode with William Quantrill, as well as another guerrilla leader there in Clay County known as Fernando Scott. He and Jesse would then go on to fight alongside Fletch Taylor, and eventually, by 1864, they were with Bloody Bill Anderson. I'm not sure why they didn't continue riding with Fletcher. If you happen to know, hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com and enlighten me. But I do know there was a lot of disagreement among the various guerrilla leaders, and a lot of fracturing at different points. I'm not going to go too in-depth on it today, but as Mr. Stiles alluded to a moment ago, there was even a point when Quantrill and Anderson were gunning for one another. Now, speaking of Anderson, he originally hailed from Kentucky. I'll try not to hold that against him. And by the time he was a teenager, he and his family were residing in Kansas, which, let's be honest, ain't much of an improvement over Kentucky. And despite Anderson nowadays being lauded as a hero, he was pretty much just a 2-bit thief. He would even readily admit that his main motivations were financial as opposed to ideological, at least towards the beginning of the war. He and his gang wouldn't join up with Quantrill's raiders until the spring of 1863, right about the same time that Frank started riding with him. Then, of course, later on that summer was when Bill's sisters were killed over in Kansas City. Fellow bushwhacker Jim Cummings would later say of Anderson, quote, "You talk about Quantrill, Todd, and Taylor being reckless raiders and fighters, but Anderson was worse than any of them." And yeah, it's from Anderson, along with his right-hand man, the maniacal little Archie Clement, that the James boys would receive a master class in guerrilla tactics. They kicked off the spring of 1864 by cutting a swath of terror across Jackson and Lafayette counties. In July, they gunned down 9 civilians in Carroll County. They continued raiding further east all the way to Monroe County, and by August of 64, they were right back in Jesse's home turf and camped out on the James farm. It's there where Jesse's mother, Zerelda, prepared what was described as a splendid feast. Kind of makes you wonder how much of the food she cooked as opposed to the slaves. Not long thereafter, the bushwhackers came across a Union man described by locals as harmless and inoffensive. But regardless, they shot him full of lead, stripped his body, and left his harmless corpse to rot there on the banks of a creek. This may or may not have been after Jesse witnessed Anderson torturing a prisoner with a knife. Eventually, Bloody Bill put the man out of his misery with a bullet to the head, but not before first removing his ears. Skip ahead to mid-August, and they engage elements of the Missouri militia over in Ray County. Finally, fighting people who can actually shoot back. Now, 2 of the U.S. soldiers who surrendered had their throats cut and scalps taken. And when a civilian made the grave mistake of riding past in a wagon, Anderson's men murdered him too. This was followed by Jesse James damn near getting his young ass killed. Story goes that Jesse spied a nice-looking saddle propped up against a fence. And when he approached, thinking that he could swap it out for his own, the saddle's owner stepped outside and put a bullet squarely in Jesse's chest. Thankfully, Frank was on hand to whisk his brother to safety. In due course, they stole a wagon and hauled Jesse to the home of a friend named John Rudd. The doctor who was summoned to treat his wounds would later recall being shown to a, quote, room in the second story, and then into a clothes closet, from the floor of which a small movable ladder reached to a trapdoor opening into a loft. There lay Jesse James in great pain and in a very dangerous condition. As it turns out, the bullet had gone through and through. Hit just outside his right nipple, nicked his rib cage, but other than that, Jesse was all right. The sawbones cleaned the holes, changed the bandages, most likely gave him a little something for the pain, and promised to return. And just 4 weeks later, Jesse James was back in the saddle, just in time to help Anderson ambush a Missouri State Militia wagon train, killing a dozen soldiers and 3 teamsters while doing so. And it was on the next day, September 24th, 1864, that Anderson linked back up with William Quantrill and George Todd. Guess they figured they'd set their differences aside in order to strike a decisive blow against the Federals. Apparently, General Price was getting ready to air quotes liberate Missouri, and he needed the bushwhackers' help. This combined force, by the way, with Anderson, Todd, and Quantrill's men, numbered somewhere between 200 to 400 hardened killers. And later on that morning, Bloody Bill, with Archie Clement and the James boys in tow, attempted to hit the town of Fayette against the advice of William Quantrill, mostly on account of Fayette being home to the pro-Union 9th Missouri. And sure enough, the attack turned out to be a disaster. Although the rebels were able to infiltrate the town in their borrowed blue uniforms, one of them couldn't help but to gun down the first black dude he saw. And after that, the fight was on. According to Frank James, their horses fell like grain before the reaper. Said it was like charging a stone wall, only if the wall was belching lead. And despite being repulsed, the James boys would account well for themselves, both stopping to render aid to their fallen comrades. Once again, according to Frank, quote, "We were in plain view of the Federals, and they simply peppered us with bullets. I was mighty scared. I knew if we raised up, we would expose ourselves to the fire of the Yankees, but we couldn't lay still. I tell you, pride makes most of us do things we wouldn't otherwise do. Well, pride kept us there until we got the wounded rolled up in a blanket, and then we made tracks." End quote. All total, the bushwhackers lost 13 killed and around 30 wounded before making their retreat. And despite outnumbering the militia 3-1, they only managed to kill a couple of them. Just ain't no two ways about it. As capable as the guerrillas were, they most definitely got their asses handed to them there in Fayette. Luckily for them, and unluckily for several Yankee soldiers on furlough, things would go much better 3 days later when they struck the town of Centralia. As was their M.O., they descended upon the populace in a fury, wearing the blue uniforms of dead U.S. soldiers, ransacking stores and plundering homes. But that wasn't really what they were there for. You see, Centralia was a depot for the North Missouri Railroad, and when a train came a chug-a-lug-lugging through later on that day, the guerrillas were waiting. They had piled heavy wooden ties on the tracks and began dinging the train with gunfire as it ground to a halt. Once stopped, the rebels entered and took 23 unarmed soldiers captive. These men, most of whom were part of Sherman's army, were simply returning home on R&R. Some of them were wounded, and as I mentioned, all of them, to a man, were unarmed. Anderson made the soldiers strip down to their long johns and then ordered them paroled, i.e. executed. When little Archie Clement suggested that he keep one of them alive to act as a bargaining chip, Bill agreed, singling out a sergeant. The rest were then unceremoniously gunned down. Those who weren't immediately killed had their heads bashed in or throats cut. This was followed by the bushwhackers robbing the frightened civilian passengers. When one of them balked at handing over his possessions, they killed him too. Once done, they set the train on fire and hightailed it out of town. Worth noting that it was Archie Clement who led that execution. One can only speculate, but I do think the odds are pretty good that either Jesse or Frank, or maybe even both, were part of the firing squad. Either way, the massacre at Centralia may have been over, but there was still plenty more killing to come. No sooner had the bushwhackers made camp that evening than a scout came riding in with news of the enemy's approach. Turns out it was a detachment of around 115 men under Major Andrew Johnston, part of the 39th Missouri Infantry. When he and his men discovered what happened at Centralia, they went in pursuit, despite the traumatized citizens warning them not to. Sure enough, the guerrillas had set up an ambush, and as Johnston approached, Anderson sent one of his best men, Dave Poole, to lure him the rest of the way into the kill zone. Oldest trick in the book, right? You send a few fast runners on ahead, make it look like they were caught by surprise, and your enemy invariably will follow. I have to imagine this tactic was taught in military academies prior to the Civil War. It must have been. But nonetheless, Major Johnston fell for it. And in doing so, he led over 100 men, most of whom were fresh recruits, straight to their graves. As soon as the soldiers entered the open meadow, on foot by the way, Anderson ordered the guerrillas forward at a trot. The Federals let loose with a volley of rifle fire with little effect. That's when the bushwhackers charged, screaming war cries as their companions spilled out from a nearby ravine. The result was a perfect slaughter. Like I said earlier, nearly every man of the 39th Missouri was killed. Those who managed to survive fled to the nearby town of Sturgeon, as Dave Poole danced on the bodies of their fallen brothers. Like he literally danced on the bodies of the dead soldiers. Other bushwhackers busied themselves taking scalps and ears, and at least one of the soldiers had his damn nose cut off. As for Jesse James, well, it turns out he was the one who did for Major Johnston. Story goes that after blowing the officer out of the saddle, Jesse turned his mount and delivered a coup de grace straight to the major's head. Full disclosure, but there are other stories claiming that while it was indeed Jesse who shot Major Johnston off his horse, it may have possibly been another bushwhacker who delivered that fatal round to Johnston's head. Meanwhile, by mid-September, Sterling Price was leading that rebel army of his in what they hoped to be the liberation of Missouri. They attacked Fort Richardson on the 24th, one of the largest battles fought in the state of Missouri. It was also a resounding defeat for the Confederates. Not only did Price lose around 1,500 men, but the survivors were forced to leave the state altogether. Hell, in time, they'd flee the entire country, migrating to Mexico until the fall of Emperor Maximilian in 1867. But that's another story for another day. Before leaving Missouri, Price ordered the bushwhackers to destroy the North Missouri Railroad. And instead of immediately setting out to do as they were told, they instead decided to terrorize the town of Glasgow over in Howard County. I'm not really sure what the motivation was here, other than maybe Glasgow being home to a wealthy Union man named Benjamin Lewis. A guy who had the absolute gall to free his own slaves. You imagine that? And for such a grave sin, Lewis was viciously beaten by Bloody Bill Anderson. If that ain't enough, Anderson then stole $5,000 from Lewis and then raped one of his female servants right in front of him, a 12-year-old black girl. Lewis would die of his injuries the following day, and sadly, I don't have any idea what happened to that little girl. Still astounds me when I hear people singing Anderson's praises. I mean, what a brave hero he was, beating civilians to death, gunning down unarmed soldiers, and raping children. What a patriot. Thankfully, nearly 2 weeks later, Anderson finally got what he had coming, at the hands of avenging angel and true Southerner, Colonel Samuel Cox. He and his specially trained 33rd Infantry made contact with Anderson's pickets on the morning of October 27th, just west of Albany, Missouri. Cox positioned his men in the trees just outside of town, and then sent a small detachment to lure the bushwhackers into an ambush, much in the same way that the guerrillas had done to Major Johnston back at Centralia. And it worked. As Cox and his soldiers waited, they heard the sound of gunfire. This was followed by their scouts rushing back to the line, closely pursued by none other than Bloody Bill Anderson and somewhere between 20 to 50 of his men. And just as soon as they were within range, Cox's riflemen unleashed hell. Rebels began toppling from their horses as others wheeled and retreated in the opposite direction. All except for Anderson and just one other man, guy historians think was possibly Captain John Rains, son of Confederate General James S. Rains. The pair charged headlong, pistols blazing, before Bloody Bill was shot from the saddle. His companion, miraculously, was able to turn his mount and make it back to the rebels unscathed. Anderson's body was then taken to Richmond, decapitated, and dragged through the streets. His head was placed on a telegraph pole, and his corpse buried in an unmarked grave. Rumor has it his pecker was also cut off before burial. Later on that day, the men of the 33rd Infantry took turns spitting and pissing on Anderson's grave. Now that was on October 26, 1864, when Bloody Bill went on to his heavenly reward. And by the 29th, the James boys were once again back home in Clay County. They knocked on the door of a Union man, pretended to ask for directions, and when he stepped outside, they shot him dead. This would be repeated later on that same day when they killed an elderly man named Ferran. Jesse James had only been gone to war for 5 months, but in that short amount of time, he had been shot twice and took God only knows how many lives. At just 17 years of age, he likely hadn't even slept with a woman yet, but he was already an accomplished killer, and apparently he had no intention of slowing down. That said, he and his brother wouldn't remain there in Clay County all that long. Frank decided to join Quantrill and continue the fight over in Kentucky, as Jesse drifted south to Texas with Archie Clement and what remained of Anderson's bushwhackers. They would return the following spring, though, a combined force of around 150 guerrillas under the leadership of Archie Clement, Dave Poole, and Anderson's brother, Jim. By this point, General Lee had already surrendered, by the way, but they dismissed the reports as just another damn Yankee lie. Fake news. And on May 7th, at around 2 a.m., they charged through the town of Holden, killing at least one bystander and looting a store before heading 5 miles down the road to Kingsville. They donned their trademark blue overcoats at the edge of town, the ones they took off dead U.S. soldiers, and by the time they left, there were 8 bodies and 5 burning buildings in their wake. One of their victims, the postmaster, was killed by Jesse himself. And then, just a few weeks after that, Jesse's war would come to a temporary end. Sources differ, but it's thought he was helping Archie Clement scout out a likely crossing on the Missouri River when they stumbled upon a small patrol of soldiers from the 3rd Wisconsin. And for once, the guerrillas were a little too slow on the draw. Before they even knew what happened, the soldiers opened fire and put a bullet in Jesse's chest, just inches from where he was shot a few months prior, a bullet he'd end up carrying for the rest of his life. According to Jesse, as soon as he was hit, he turned to kill one of the soldiers' horses. Quote, "That'll stop a man every time. That ended the fight. I was near a creek and I lay in the water all night. I felt as if I was burning up. The next morning I crawled up the bank and there was a man plowing nearby who helped me get to my friends. I was in a dreadful fix and everybody thought that the wound would be mortal." End quote. Just an FYI, but Jesse would later claim that he was riding to Lexington to surrender and carrying a white flag, but the Yanks ended up opening fire. And that very well may be true. Whatever the case, though, for the second time in his young life, Jesse James was horribly wounded. And considering that the bullet had punctured a lung, this time it would take a lot longer than 4 weeks till he was again able to sit a saddle. How things were so dire that his fellow rebels even loaded him onto a wagon and risked carrying him to Lexington. This time, no shots were fired, and Jesse was able to get some proper doctoring. He was also officially taken as a prisoner of war. At least for a little bit. Remember, the Civil War was basically over. And despite Jesse being more outlaw than soldier, he still got paroled right alongside everybody else. And it wasn't just him. As he lay there on what many thought would be his deathbed, his bushwhacking compadres also started straggling into Lexington, likewise looking to surrender. Frank would do the same over in Kentucky just a few weeks later following the death of Quantrill. Now, Jesse would stay in Lexington for about a month before being transferred, once again via wagon, to his uncle's place just north of Kansas City. At the time, his mother and stepfather were living in exile in Nebraska. According to a friend, Jesse was emaciated, tottering as he walked, and fighting what seemed to everyone a hopeless battle. His wound would not heal, and more ominous, every now and then there was a hemorrhage. End of quote. So yeah, dude was in pretty serious shape. Thankfully, he had his smoking hot first cousin Z to nurse him back to health. And cousins or not, they apparently made quite the impression on one another. This is just the beginning of a courtship that would eventually culminate in their marriage in 1874. Z, by the way, was named after Jesse's mother, Zerelda. Got to imagine it'd be a bit awkward getting hitched to someone with the same name as your mom, but hey, to each their own. More on these lovebirds here in a bit, but as Jesse struggled to stay in the land of the living, things there in Missouri continued to worsen. All throughout the state, those who had been loyal to the Republic suffered greatly at the hands of the guerrillas. And these same people, at least the ones who survived, were outraged to learn that the bushwhackers would be treated like regular soldiers when they surrendered. All they had to do was take that same oath that Jesse and Frank took, and that was it. They could then return home without fearing retribution. Official retribution, that is. You see, the Missourians who fought for the North were also returning home. They too were battle-hardened and armed to the teeth. And that's another thing. Prior to hostilities, almost nobody in Missouri owned a revolver. Now everybody did, even the little kids. And most of them owned multiple. There's a great photo of one of the bushwhacker leaders, Dave Poole, carrying a whopping 4 revolvers, one in his hand and 3 more strapped to his waist. Frank James would later claim that he never carried more than 2, but there are stories of him stalking the streets of Kearney, Missouri, sporting a total of 8 revolvers. And his buddy, Archie Clement, was said to have gone through at least 11 of them during the fight that cost him his life, which we will be discussing later. These dudes were absolutely armed to the gills, but then again, so was pretty much everybody else. In other words, despite the Confederates losing, Missouri remained extremely violent following the war's end. And a good deal of this centered around politics. What else is new, right? Seems like pretty much everything bad comes from politics. It's a lot to get into here. I may expand on this later on in the series. But especially after the war, when the so-called radical Republicans had the run of the state, they were enacting a lot of laws that proved very unpopular. For instance, if you served in the Confederate Army, or even supported the Confederates in pretty much any capacity, then you weren't allowed to vote. You couldn't hold public office. Hell, you couldn't even be a teacher or a minister. This didn't set too well with many of the former Confederates there in Missouri. They also weren't too happy about the former slaves having freedom. And it was all of this that absolutely led to more than a little post-war strife. Now, as far as Jesse James is concerned, he would finally return home to his mama's farm in October of '64. A family friend would later state that Jesse then joined the local Baptist church. Quote, "I think he was baptized, and for a year or 2 acted as if he were a sincere and true Christian. He was quiet, affable, and gentle in his actions. He was liked by everyone who knew him." Okay, maybe. I mean, hey, I do enjoy a nice testimony. But then again, by early 1866, I guess Jesse was having second thoughts as the old gang was once more back together. Archie Clement returned from Texas, as did Jim Anderson, and his brother Frank was back in Clay County by that point as well. Oath or no oath, they remained unreconstructed. And for the James boys especially, things were just getting started. He stood at just 5 feet tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. But by the time he turned 20, he was one of the most feared men in all of Missouri. His name was Archie Clement, rode with the likes of Bloody Bill Anderson and the James boys during the war. And while most of his compadres laid down their arms after Lee's surrender, Archie kept right on a killing. He also led the very first daylight bank robbery in American history. But who was Archie really? How did a quiet farmer's kid from Missouri turn into such a cold-blooded killer? Is it true that it took over 30 bullets just to put him down? And even then, he was still trying to cock the revolver with his teeth? And what exactly were Archie's final words? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! Archibald Clement was born on January 1st, 1846 in Stokes County, North Carolina. The son of Southern farmers who soon pulled up stakes and headed west to Missouri, which in hindsight may not have been the best of choices. You see, back in those days, Missouri was basically a war zone even before the war had started. Towns were split, families divided, and lifelong friends became mortal enemies overnight. All it took was a whispered opinion in the wrong company, and before you knew it, you were getting dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. And that's the environment the young Archie Clement grew up in. By the time he was 15 and the war had officially begun, he had spent years in a world where loyalty meant everything, and revenge was practically a family value. There's not really any evidence that Clement received much in the way of a formal education, and as I alluded to in the intro, he was a little on the small side, barely over 5 feet tall and, per sources, weighing in at around 130 pounds. But what he lacked in stature, he more than made up for in intensity. Even his neighbors would later recall Archie as quiet, focused, and strangely composed for someone so young. At some point, either in 1863 or early 1864, he fell in with Bloody Bill Anderson and his merry band of bushwhackers. In fact, it would be under Anderson's bloody wing that Archie Clement would shed whatever innocence he had left, and in doing so, he'd become one of the most feared guerrilla fighters Missouri would ever know. Case in point, on September 27, 1864, they rolled into Centralia, Missouri, and began looting the town. As soon as they had their fill of women and whiskey, they started tearing up the railroad track. And then, once the next train came screeching to a halt, they hopped on board, robbed the passengers, and they removed 24 Union troops who were returning home on furlough. These soldiers were unarmed, by the way. Hell, they weren't even in uniform. But I reckon it didn't matter much. The guerrillas lined them up anyway and gunned all but 2 of them down. And you better believe our very own Archie Clement was right there in the thick of it. Not just dropping hammers, but allegedly even going so far as to scalp the corpses. A note left behind at the scene read as follows: "You come to hunt bushwhackers, now you are scalped. Clement scalped you. Signed, William Anderson." The word scalped, by the way, was spelled S-K-E-L-P-T. Yeah, they signed their war crimes admission with a spelling error. But be that as it may, the point was still crystal clear. Missouri was not a safe haven for the Yankees, and apparently young Clement wanted authorities to know exactly who was to blame. Later on that same afternoon, a Major Johnston rode into Centralia with 146 men from the newly formed 39th Missouri Mounted Infantry. And despite warnings from the townsfolk that there were at least 80 well-armed guerrillas nearby, Johnston pressed on. That was his first mistake. And when he and his men finally caught sight of the bushwhackers, he made the second and final decision to have his men dismount and form a skirmish line. Armed with nothing but slow-loading rifles, the green recruits never even stood a chance. By contrast, Anderson's guerrillas were carrying multiple revolvers apiece. They simply charged the Union line on horseback, and by the time the smoke cleared, over 120 U.S. soldiers were dead. Now, this was obviously a huge victory for the Confederates, but unfortunately for them, the good times wouldn't last for long. In fact, less than a month later, Bill Anderson himself would be killed in a similar ambush, at which point his protege, Archie Clement, took over. Of course, by that point, the war was damn near over. Lee would surrender just a few months after Anderson's death, and all across the country, men began putting down their rifles and trying to go back to some version of normal. Just not Archie Clement. He was still riding hard throughout Missouri, hitting towns like Lexington and demanding their surrender at gunpoint. The mission was no longer really about preserving the Confederacy or even states' rights or anything like that. What Archie was doing, for the most part, was personal. Not only were they trying their level best to humiliate the victors, but they were also attempting to rewrite the end of the war on their own terms. So naturally, when the time came to decide between lying low or striking back, Archie Clement once again chose violence. Only this time, rather than engage the enemy in some wide open field or wooded ravine, it was a bank in the town of Liberty, Missouri. Now I know what you're thinking. Bank robberies in the Wild West go hand in hand. And yeah, that would certainly come to be the case, but back in the mid-1860s, these types of robberies were nearly unheard of. Truth be told, what Arch and his buddies would do there in Liberty would go down as the very first daylight bank robbery in all of American history. And the best part was they managed to make off with over $58,000, or well over $1 million in today's money. But then again, it wasn't just about the money. Remember what I said a moment ago about them trying to strike a blow against the victors? You see, the bank's owners were all Unionists, former militiamen who, just a year prior, were hunting down Clement's fellow guerrillas like dogs. And by robbing that bank, Archie was once again sending a message. The war may be over, but you will never be safe. Keep in mind that the state of Missouri was going through some pretty significant changes. Reconstruction was underway, and the Republican Party, backed by former Union officers and Northern interest, was trying to cement control. That being the case, as the pivotal 1866 election rapidly approached, Archie began ramping up his efforts. He and his gang rode into towns across Lafayette County, strong-arming voters, intimidating officials, and letting everyone know that casting a Republican ballot might just get you a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Hell, on Election Day, Clement even led a group of around 100 armed bushwhackers into Lexington itself, firing shots into the air and daring anyone to challenge them. And it worked, mostly because nobody wanted to get shot walking to the courthouse. These little victories notwithstanding, little Archie's time was quickly coming to an end. Then Governor Thomas Fletcher was getting a little tired of his antics, so he brought in the deliciously named Major Bacon Montgomery. Formerly of the 6th Missouri Cavalry, Bacon gained a reputation for bravery in the Vicksburg and Red River campaigns. He was also an outspoken radical Republican, which made him a mortal enemy of Clement and the Missouri Bushwhackers. And yeah, Montgomery quickly assembled a team of killers. Former soldiers like George Moses, J.M. Turley, Dave Thornton, and Monty Cantel, all of whom, as Moses put it, quote, had carried their lives in their hands all through the war. In other words, they weren't necessarily afraid of a guy like Archie Clement, and they weren't afraid because they were cut from the exact same cloth. Montgomery and his men formed up in Sedalia and made their way toward Lafayette County. They had previously been told they wouldn't be allowed in, and sure enough, they were met at the county line by armed guerrillas. But thankfully, the rebels scattered without a fight, and Montgomery and his men were able to enter Lexington without firing a shot. Now, at that time in Missouri, there was a new law that required all able-bodied men to register for potential service in the state militia. And in what may have either been a joke or an attempt to bait a trap, Archie Clement sent word to the major that he'd like to come in and register, on the condition that he be granted safe passage. And believe it or not, Montgomery agreed. So it were on December 13th, 1866, that Archie and his gang rode into Lexington calm as you please, ostentatiously to sign up for the militia. The same militia, by the way, that Archie had spent years ambushing. And yeah, Montgomery was true to his word. He let Clement and his boys in without incident. And then, just as soon as Archie was done signing up with the militia, he headed over to a nearby church and applied for the position of Sunday school teacher. Believe it or not, he was hired right there on the spot and spent the rest of his life as a man of the cloth. In addition to instructing the town's children on the good book, he would also travel the state and give lectures, stating on multiple occasions that he regretted his former actions and even going so far as to denounce the Confederacy to his very last breath. And no, that is definitely not what happened. Archie and his men really did ride into Lexington, that much was true. And after they signed up for the militia, they all hauled ass, except for Archie Clement and another old boy by the name of Hicklin. Rather than leave, they instead opted to head on over to the saloon and wet their whistles. Who knows, man? Maybe Clement thought that the deal still held, or maybe he just felt invincible, or maybe he was just plumb tuckered out. Either way, Archie was still in Lexington, and that clock was a-ticking. Sure enough, someone sent word to the major that Archie was still hanging around getting his drink on, so Montgomery sent a few of his men, led by the aforementioned George Moses, to deal with him. Now, these guys were under instructions to play it cool, just to enter the saloon, have a few drinks, and bide their time until Clement let his guard down. But you know what they say about the best laid plans, right? Unbeknownst to Moses and the others, Montgomery had sent in an additional team under a Sergeant Joe Wood. And whereas that first bunch were still playing it cool, Wood just boldly stormed into the saloon and loudly demanded Archie's surrender. And what followed was pure chaos. Per historian T.J. Stiles, quote, "Immediately Clement jumped from his chair and drew his revolvers, as his friend hopped over a billiard table and scrambled for the stairs. Moses snapped off a shot and caught Clement's companion in the leg, then chased after Archie as he ran into a side office, where Moses shot him in the right side of his chest, sending him sprawling." End of quote. Now that should have ended it for most men, but Archie was too damn mean to die so easily. He may have gone down, but he was back on his feet seconds later. He rushed outside for his horse, with Moses and the others fast on his trail. To once again quote Mr. Stiles, "The wounded bushwhacker and his pursuers fired rapidly at each other as they careened down the icy street, past the courthouse where the rest of the militiamen were waiting. A roar sounded from its window and Clement tumbled to the ground." End of quote. Now, it's worth noting that both Archie and his horse had taken multiple rounds. And sources differ, but either that fall or an enemy bullet had shattered his right arm. Nevertheless, by the time Montgomery's men finally caught up with him, they found the mangled and barely conscious Clement attempted to cock his last revolver with his teeth. And I say last revolver because Archie was reportedly carrying as many as 11 pistols when the fight broke out. Sounds like a lot, but this was pretty common when it came to the bushwhackers. You gotta think, they did the bulk of their fighting from the saddle, and they didn't always have time to stop and reload when they were in the thick of the battle. There's a famous photo of one of the Missouri guerrillas, a guy by the name of Dave Poole, who, as fate would have it, was also one of the men who accompanied Clement into Lafayette. But in this picture, you can see Dave carrying at least 4 revolvers. And another former bushwhacker and future bandit, Frank James, was once witnessed stalking the streets of Kearney with a whopping 8 pistols. So I don't necessarily find it all that unbelievable that Clement would have gone through 11 in his failed escape. And just to give you an idea how many shots were fired, at least in Archie's direction, he was said to have been riddled by over 30 rounds, 24 of which were in the torso. And yet he was still clinging to life, at least long enough to utter his final words. Quote, "I've done what I said I would always do. Die before I surrender." Maybe. Full disclosure, but there are others who maintain that his last words were much simpler. Just a raspy, "oh hell," before giving up the ghost. It was 18 days before his 21st birthday. and Archie Clement was dead. Per author Edward Leslie, in his book The Devil Knows How to Ride, quote, his corpse was washed, dressed, and put on display. The inevitable photograph was taken. There is disagreement today over where he is buried. Graves in 2 different Western cemeteries are said to contain his remains. End of quote. Sounds a whole lot like Jack Hinson, the last guy we covered. As far as I know, nobody knows where he's buried either. Now, I did search for that death photo, but I was not able to locate it. As far as I'm aware, the only existing image of Archie is the one where he was posing with Dave Poole and another bushwhacker named Bill Hendricks when they were wintering in Texas back in 1863. But hey, I have been wrong in the past. Love him or hate him, Archie Clement was about as tough as they come. It took an ambush, a bar fight, multiple gunmen, and over 30 bullets to stop him. Hell, even Major Montgomery would later state that he had, quote, never met better grit on the face of the earth. Sadly, however, Clement's death would fail to break the cycle of violence there in Missouri. If anything, his death had simply passed the torch. Within just a few years, one of his former brothers in arms, Jesse James, would explode onto the national stage. And in time, the James Younger boys would become household names. Bank robberies, train heists, shootouts, they did it all. And although most folks remember Jesse as the leader, it was Archie Clement who laid the blueprint. He's the one who had taken their particular brand of guerrilla warfare and repackaged it as organized crime. It was Archie who proved that fear could steal elections, that revenge could be profitable, and that you didn't need a war to keep on fighting. All you needed was a target. And as strange as it may sound, even today there are some who view Clement as a hero. Well, what do you think? Chime down below in the comments and let me know. Was he a cold-blooded killer? Was he a hero? Or, you know what I'm about to say, was it somewhere in the middle? By the way, just a quick note on Clement's last name. It's sometimes listed as Clement, and other times it's Clements with an S. So I decided to check the quote-unquote official records. On the 1850 census, it's Clement, just like I've been saying throughout the course of this episode. But then on the 1860 census, they dropped the T and added an S, Clemens. I found who I believe to be Archie's mother on the 1870 census, and this time they brought back the T and kept the S, making it Clements. That said, I did find one of Archie's older brothers on a different 1860 census, and he too spelled it without the S at the end. I could have probably kept on digging, I just didn't really have the time. And besides, whatever his name was, Clement or Clements, he was still a deadly little cuss. What happens when you push the wrong man too far? And what happens when that man has a particular set of skills that could turn your life into a living nightmare? Well, in the fall of 1862, that man turned out to be a Tennessee farmer by the name of Jack Hinson. You see, 2 of Jack's sons were executed after being falsely identified as Confederate guerrillas. The Yankee soldiers tied them to a tree, filled them full of holes, and then placed their severed heads on the family's gateposts. And from that day forward, Jack's personal goal in life was to make the Union soldiers pay dearly for what they had done. Armed with nothing but a custom-built rifle, Hinson turned the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers into literal kill zones. He hunted down officers from the shadows, guided Confederate units on daring raids, and built a reputation as one of the most feared snipers in all of the Civil War. Or at least that's how the legend goes. Who was the real Jack Hinson? Are the stories true about him being a peace-loving farmer pushed to the brink? Or was he just a violent secessionist who finally found an outlet for his uncontrollable temper? And how true is the story about his sons being executed? Did that even happen? Join me today as we dive headfirst into the life, the legend, and possibly even the truth behind the Civil War's most accomplished sharpshooter. And yeah, we will also be discussing whether or not Jack Hinson really took out 100 Union troops. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! You may find this hard to believe, but Jack Hinson was not always a one-man killing machine. In fact, prior to the Civil War, he was a wealthy farmer. One that, according to legend, wanted absolutely no part in the coming hostilities. Born in North Carolina around the year 1807, Jack's family would migrate to Tennessee when he was still a boy. He married Elizabeth James in the mid-1830s, and they'd ultimately settle in Stewart County, some 80 or so miles northwest of Nashville. And yeah, Jack ended up building a pretty comfortable life for himself. He and Elizabeth would have a total of 10 children, many of whom were boys. They had a large plantation known as Bubbling Springs, and in the years to come, they'd acquire over 100 slaves. Not really something I go around bragging about, but as far as the antebellum South was concerned, Jack Hinson was pretty well off financially. But be that as it may, the surrounding countryside was quickly descending into chaos, especially once the Civil War broke out. Confederate guerrillas began ambushing Union patrols as pro-Union farmers were terrorized by their own neighbors. Bandits were capitalizing on the lawlessness by robbing pretty much everybody, and entire communities were being attacked based on their loyalties, or in a lot of cases, their perceived loyalties. But through it all, Jack Hinson remained neutral, at least initially. He wouldn't reach for his rifle until the fall of 1862. That's when his sons, George and Jack Jr., were executed by Union soldiers. It's worth noting that his sons were not themselves soldiers, okay? Hell, they weren't even bushwhackers. In all actuality, they were just out hunting for venison when they bumped into a Yankee patrol. Troops just assumed they were either spies or guerrillas, so they tied them to a tree and shot them to pieces. They then paraded their bodies through the nearby town of Dover before cutting their heads off and mounting them on the gatepost of the Hinson plantation. Good God Almighty. And then, of course, as soon as old man Hinson was done burying his boys and sending the rest of his family to live with relatives, he began plotting his revenge. By the way, Jack was in his late 50s at this point, so we're not exactly talking about a spring chicken. That said, he didn't make it damn near 6 decades without having a trick or two up his sleeve. And as you're about to find out, that dog could most definitely still hunt. His first kill was the lieutenant who ordered his son's execution. Hinson laid in wait until the officer rode by at the head of a column. And just as soon as he squeezed the trigger, he melted away into the forest like a ghost. The next target was the sergeant who had nailed the boys' heads to the gateposts. Once again, Jack waited until the Yankees came riding by, and once again, all it took was just one shot. Despite once more vanishing into the brush, it wouldn't take authorities long to put 2 and 2 together. They soon pegged Hinson as the killer and burnt his plantation to the ground. Of course, by that point, Jack was already long gone, hiding out in the various caves and ridges along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Truth be told, it was these waterways that would serve almost like conveyor belts, just steadily delivering targets rotten to Jack's unwavering and very accurate sights. He'd just sit there at his perch overlooking the river, biding his time. And even then, when a Union transport or gunboat came into view, Hinson wouldn't just blindly open fire. Instead, he'd wait patiently until he was able to identify the officers. And the results were devastating. Imagine being a Yankee private. One minute you're floating down the river, humming the battle hymn of the Republic, dreaming about clam chowder. And the next thing you know, your commanding officer drops to the deck with a hole in his chest. Moments later, the second in command grabs at his throat as he begins choking on his own blood. Panic sets in, nobody else knows what in the hell to do, and the entire operation grinds to a halt. And per legend, Jack was able to do this time and time again. In fact, there are some who claim that he killed as many as 100 soldiers throughout the course of the war. I'm not sure how true that is. We will discuss what I think is a more accurate number later on. But military records do confirm that the U.S. Army was indeed losing men to a lone sniper there in Stewart County. And with every shot fired, Jack's legend grew larger in scale. One story that I found especially entertaining was the time that Jack's sharpshooting was so relentless, an entire Union transport surrendered after he started picking off its crew. The captain thought they were under attack by an entire regiment as opposed to an over-the-hill farmer, so he ran the boat aground and raised a white flag. Meanwhile, Jack had just slipped back into the woods like always and left the surviving crew just to stew in their own embarrassment. By the way, that rifle of his, it wasn't just some rusty old squirrel gun, okay? It was a custom-made .50 caliber, weighing in at 17 pounds with a 41-inch rifle barrel and a German silver bead for the front sight. For all you gun aficionados out there, it was supposedly modeled after the famous British Whitworth. Now, for the most part, Jack operated alone. No uniform, no chain of command, and no official rank. But he would occasionally step out of the shadows and join forces with the Confederates. Like in November of 1864 when he served as a guide for General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Their subsequent attack on a Union supply depot proved to be such a resounding success that even General Sherman described it as a feat of arms which I must confess excited my admiration. And so it went for the remainder of the conflict. Every bend in the river, every ridge line, and every farmhouse became a potential hiding place for old Jack. And for 3 long years, despite having the full weight of the Union war machine hunting him down, they never even got close to catching him. And once Lee surrendered and the war was officially over, Jack just simply returned home and began rebuilding his life. That said, he would pay a very heavy toll. In addition to George and Jack Jr., he also lost another son named Robert. I've also seen other accounts claiming that additional children succumbed to disease while he was off fighting. Still, though, by 1870, he and the rest of his family were still there in Stewart County, not far from the now ghost town of Danville. Or at least that's where they were living on the 1870 census. By 1874, however, Jack and his family were residing in nearby Houston County. And it's there on April 18th that the infamous sniper finally met his match. Jack began complaining of a severe pain between his shoulders. The doctor was sent for, remedies were administered, but nevertheless, within just a few hours, the 67-year-old Hinson had gone on to meet his maker. According to his obituary, it was most likely a case of meningitis. And yeah, that's the legend of Jack Hinson, the rebel sniper who embarked on a personal vendetta that wound up costing the lives of 100 Union soldiers. Maybe. Look, before we get too carried away turning Jack into some kind of a Confederate John Wick, I do think we need to pump the brakes just a bit and take a closer look. Turns out there might be more to the story than meets the eye. The common narrative regarding Hinson is that he was a neutral, peace-loving man who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the war. That he was against secession, and while he did own slaves, he treated them like family. To the point that when he set them free, they chose to remain on the plantation, out of undying love and loyalty. Others, however, paint a much different picture. That of a hot-headed secessionist who picked fights with pretty much anyone who so much as looked at him sideways. A man who used the conflict as an excuse to indulge in his most violent tendencies, as well as to settle some old grudges. Truth is, there's not a lot of concrete evidence one way or the other. But what little information we do have doesn't necessarily cast Hinson in the best light. I'll give you a for instance. Court documents show that he was arrested on multiple occasions prior to the war, for everything from assault and battery to public brawling in the town square. There are accusations that he killed a neighbor's mule, and by some accounts, Jack was hauled into court more than any other resident of Stewart County. Not exactly the actions of a gentleman farmer minding his own business. Jack also didn't shy away from politics. He may have been neutral in the sense that he didn't wear a blue or gray uniform, but he was a slave owner. And contrary to popular belief, he did vote for secession. Even his own neighbors would describe him as being a loyal secession man right from the start. I just wanted to toss that out there. I know the idea of Jack being a quiet and pious man who just wanted to be left alone, only to then be thrown into a war he didn't want any part of, is a very compelling narrative, but it's just not supported by the facts. There's also questions regarding the deaths of his sons, George and Jack Jr. Not everyone is so convinced that they were as innocent as commonly believed. Worth noting that George was 22 and Jr. was 17 at the time of their executions, so they weren't exactly young children. And that other son I mentioned a moment ago, Robert, he really was a bushwhacker. We know that for a fact. He even led his own little band of guerrillas before getting killed. And just to toss in some further confusion, there are some historians that claim that George and Jack Jr. were still alive after their alleged deaths in 1862, which, if true, would turn the entire story on its head. I'm not saying that's the case, and I'm also not saying that Jack's sons were guilty of being bushwhackers or spies or anything like that. But what I am saying is that the situation might not be as cut and dry as a lot of people seem to think. And then there's the fact that Hinson didn't just stop at killing Yankee soldiers. As I alluded to just a minute ago, he also used the war as a way of settling old grudges. Like on December 31st, 1862. While most folks were busy ringing in the new year, Jack was plotting a deadly rendezvous with his former neighbor, a Swiss immigrant named Albert Rougemont. Turns out they'd been butting heads for years, and Rougemont had once testified in court against Hinson. I guess Jack never forgot about it, and on New Year's Eve, 1862, he finally had his druthers and shot Rougemont deader in hell. There was an investigation. A provost marshal even began going around collecting testimony, and what he uncovered wasn't really all that positive. Neighbors would describe Hinson as being violent for about as long as anyone could remember, always spoiling for a fight, and with a reputation for being one of the most aggressive men in Stewart County. Basically, if you lived there in Stewart County, chances are you had either seen Jack whoop somebody's ass, or at the very least, you had witnessed him threatening to whoop somebody's ass. That said, the ultimate findings of the investigation were never recorded. Who knows, maybe the Army had bigger fish to fry. Or maybe, considering the chaotic nature of the region, they never found conclusive evidence one way or the other. Or maybe Rougemont just had it coming. Whatever the case, it's stories like these that cause many to doubt Jack's entire legacy. And the only reason I even bring this up, I promise I'm not trying to be the Grinch who stole history or anything like that. All I'm trying to do is illustrate how complicated history can be when compared to the legends. In the case of Jack Hinson, we have a man who, by most reliable accounts, was already violent prior to his sons being killed. He was also a very strong supporter of the Southern cause, and unlike what's normally reported, he absolutely made no qualms about using the war to settle personal grudges. A far cry from the legend of him being a peace-loving, conscientious objector. We'll discuss this more in just a moment, but believe it or not, we still have the rifle that Hinson used during the war. As recently as 2011, it was owned by a Tennessee judge named Ben McFarland. And one of the most fascinating aspects of the rifle are the 36 notches or circles that are punched into the top of the barrel, each one signifying a dead Union soldier. Now, obviously, 36 is a far cry from Hinson's alleged kill count of 100, but this is usually explained away as the notches indicating dead officers. I guess the idea is that Jack either didn't consider the rank and file soldiers to be worth noting, or he just stopped counting over time. Or hear me out, maybe he really did only kill 36 men as opposed to 100. I guarantee you, out of everything I say on today's episode, this is going to be the part I get the most pushback on. I don't know who needs to hear this, but the killing of 36 people over the span of less than 4 years is a pretty big deal, okay? That's a lot of ghosts to be hauling around behind you. It's also far more than your average soldier will ever get close to attaining. There was something like 3.2 million people who served in the Civil War on both sides, and the total number of dead was just at around 700,000. So obviously not everyone was out there stacking bodies. In fact, just going by the numbers alone, it would appear as if the majority of troops failed to kill a single opponent, especially when you take into account that most of the deaths were caused by diseases or infections rather than direct combat. So even if Hinson's kill count was just 36, that is still an astronomical number. It's also believable. Whenever I see these really highly inflated body counts, there is very rarely any evidence to back them up. Just rumors and anecdotal stories. The same is true for pretty much every notable figure from the Old West, and Jack Hinson is certainly no exception. Is it possible that he killed 100 people? Absolutely. But until I see some actual evidence, I'm going to have to chalk it up to exaggeration. Hell, even Jack's burial is the subject of controversy. According to his obituary in the Clarksville Weekly Chronicle, he was buried at the Boyd Cemetery. But family tradition points to a different plot over at Cane Creek. And to this day, both locations claim him, at least as far as I'm aware. If you have additional information, or you just like to tell me how wrong I am about any of this, please feel free to hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. Now, me personally, I couldn't care less about Jack Hinson being a violent man prior to the war. I don't care about his history of owning slaves, or even the story about him gunning down his own neighbor. Jack may not have been a role model, and he certainly wasn't someone who I'd want as a friend. But his story is still fascinating, regardless of his personal morals. He may have been a deeply flawed human being, but he was also a little bit of a badass. You know who else were badass? The Spartans. And do you know what the Spartans did to little boys? Don't answer that. And if you don't know, don't go looking it up. Trust me, it'll make you sick to your stomach. It does beg the question, though. Why is it that we as a society are so eager to sanitize our history? What makes us so prone to turning our heroes into saints? Life is messy. Human beings are definitely messy. And by proxy, history is also messy. And it very rarely ever fits neatly into our worldview. Jack Hinson was a slave owner. But then again, so were a lot of other people throughout the course of human history. Why not just leave it at that? Why change his story to make it seem as if he was some benevolent master who his slaves adored? Jack Hinson was also a deadly sniper. He killed a lot of enemy soldiers along the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. That much is a fact. But what's the point in exaggerating it to the point that it's unbelievable, saying that he killed 100 Yankees? Look, there's a lot of great historical fiction out there, both in print and film. There's no shortage of fantasy novels to help you escape reality. So I really don't understand why we need to change real history just to make ourselves feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside. If you want to do that, just turn on the goddamn Hallmark channel, okay? Look, wherever you stand on this, at the end of the day, I don't think any of us can deny that Jack Hinson has become a symbol. For some, he's the embodiment of Southern defiance. And for others, he's an example of how quickly the lines between soldier and murderer can vanish in a not-so-civil war. Hinson's story isn't clean, and it's not neat. But that rifle and those notches, along with the fear that he carved into Union patrols there in Tennessee, those remain undeniable, regardless of our inclinations to pad his story with a bunch of made-up nonsense. But what do you think? Am I being too skeptical? Was Hinson really just a neutral and peace-loving farmer driven to revenge by a brutal injustice? Or was he a die-hard secessionist who used the tragedy of war as a cover for his own personal vendettas? Or was it a mix of both? We may never know. As it stands today, his story is mostly apocryphal. There are a few key details that we can point to as fact, but the rest has yet to be corroborated. It is fun to think about, though. Regardless of his true history or motives, I do love me a good revenge story. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Jack Hinson. I will show you that I can kill men with as much skill and rapidity as anybody. From this time on, I ask no quarter, and I will give none. These were the words spoken by Bloody Bill Anderson shortly before he executed and scalped over 20 men. According to those who rode with him, Anderson was, quote, a desperate man and a reckless fighter, the worst devil in the bunch. He could shoot a man who was on his knees begging for mercy as easy as most men kill a chicken. He feared no man alive and believed heart and soul in the Southern cause. Who was Bloody Bill Anderson? What events transpired that caused him to devote his entire life to war? A life that he once spoke of saying, quote, if I cared for my life, I would have lost it long ago. Wanting to lose it, I cannot throw it away. Was Bill Anderson a reluctant hero caught up in the passions of civil war, or just a bloodthirsty villain, using any excuse he could to terrorize the countryside? William T. Anderson, better known as Bill Anderson, was born in Hopkins County, Kentucky, sometime around 1829, one of at least 7 children born to father William C. Anderson and mother Martha Jane Thomason. And the Andersons would do quite a bit of moving around when Bill was a kid. The family left Kentucky for Palmyra, Missouri, before relocating to Iowa, and then back down to Missouri. Bill's father, William, would spend a short amount of time in California before moving the family again in 1857, this time to Kansas. By the year 1860, the family could be found in Agnes City, about 100 miles west of Kansas City. Bill's daddy had previously worked as a hat maker, but soon tried his hand at farming, a job his sons, or at least young Bill, would help him out with. Matter of fact, the younger Anderson was at one point a joint owner of over 300 acres with his father. Turns out, however, that farming possibly wasn't the only source of income for the Anderson family. Looks like they might have been dabbling in a little bit of horse thievery as well. Which brings us to the first disclaimer of this episode. Bloody Bill Anderson is a somewhat divisive figure. All you've got to do is Google the man and you'll find sources like PBS's American Experience making the claim that Bill was a butcher and a sociopath who came from a family of horse thieves and lived for spilling blood. There are others who will make the claim that Anderson was more of a hero, albeit a reluctant one. Almost like Clint Eastwood's Josie Wells character. A man forced into war to both avenge his family and protect his neighbors from an oppressive invading wave of northern aggression. As such, any talk of him being a horse thief or a criminal are either exaggerated or flat out made up in an attempt to smear his name. And we will try to look into which one of these narratives is the most correct on this episode. Just know that I am fully aware that some sources on Bill Anderson are biased. And also know that I have no dog in this fight. I'm just an impartial observer of history who's trying to be as factual as possible. And possibly attempting to work in a couple of dad jokes while I'm at it. With that said, according to at least one source I found, Bill's father was not only suspected of being a horse thief, but was even arrested for it, at least on one occasion. It also seems that 2 of his children, our very own Bill Anderson and his brother Ellis, had somewhat of a wild streak themselves. Both brothers got in separate yet deadly shooting scrapes with Native Americans there in Kansas sometime in the late 1850s, with Bill claiming that the man he killed, a member of the Kaw tribe, had been trying to rob him. Anderson would leave Kansas around this time, but it does not look like his departure was related to the shooting. He headed on down the Santa Fe Trail with a load of freight bound for New Mexico, but returned shortly thereafter empty-handed. saying that all his cargo, even the horses, had just up and disappeared. Whoopsie! After this air quotes failed venture, Bill would take to trading horses between Kansas and Missouri. It was also around this time that his mother, Martha Jane, was tragically killed by a lightning strike, right there in her front yard. Now this was 1860, so Bill was somewhere between like 20 and 22 years old, and things were really starting to heat up there in eastern Kansas, which brings us to disclaimer number 2. It's impossible to discuss Bloody Bill Anderson without discussing the American Civil War. It's also equally as impossible to discuss the border warfare that would take place there in Kansas and Missouri without discussing slavery. With all that in mind, I mean what I'm about to say in the nicest way possible. So please hear me out before you turn this episode off in anger. I have no desire to debate whether or not the Civil War was fought over slavery. I personally believe it was. If you don't agree, that's fine. I know a lot of you listening are pretty firm believers in the idea that the war was fought over states' rights. Once again, okay, that's fine. We're just going to have to agree to disagree. However, there's no disputing the fact that slavery would have a major impact on the life of Bloody Bill Anderson, even though neither he nor his family were slave owners. I'll explain why. The war between the states did not just spontaneously happen. Tensions had been building for decades upon decades, going all the way back to the founding of the country. Even back then, those who were philosophically opposed to the institution of slavery kind of swept it under the rug and made concessions so as to prevent the brand new republic from splitting in two. Still, though, individual states began making moves very early on. Pennsylvania, for example, adopted a statute that provided for the freedom of every slave born after its enactment in 1780. The first state to officially abolish slavery outright was Massachusetts in 1783. We're talking almost 80 years before the Civil War would begin. See what I mean about things slowly building up over time? New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, one by one, all the northern states began abolishing slavery. Now, granted, some of these states adopted a gradual approach to emancipation. States like New Jersey, who were limited to only owning slaves born before the year 1805. By 1860, there were still a total of 18 slaves in the Garden State. Now, they technically weren't listed as slaves, but as individuals indentured for life. Kind of messed up, but honestly, what else would you expect from the same state that gave us the Jersey Shore and Chelsea Handler? Now, despite New Jersey's less than perfect progress, they were still doing way more than any of the southern states, who, even by the year 1860, had made zero efforts when it came to abolishing slavery. Before long, you had a mix of slave states and free states. Almost in the same way we now have red and blue states, both vying for control of the federal government. The country was also rapidly expanding, with more and more territories being admitted into the Union. Therefore, it became a big deal whether or not these would-be states were slave or free territories. In the year 1820, there was something called the Missouri Compromise. Basically, what had happened was Maine was admitted to the Union as a free state at the same time Missouri was admitted as a slave state. The compromise came in the form of legislation that was passed prohibiting slavery from any remaining territories in the Louisiana Purchase land north of the 3630 parallel. In other words, after the Missouri Compromise of 1820, all new states would be free states. But Josh, what the hell does any of this have to do with Bloody Bill Anderson? I'm getting there. Just simmer down. There was something else that happened called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Pierce in 1854. This act and the idea of something called popular sovereignty pretty much repelled the Missouri Compromise that I just mentioned by saying that the citizens of the new territories like Nebraska and Kansas, where Bill lived, could decide for themselves whether or not they'd be free or slave states. Now, the Nebraska issue was already settled. Its population was staunchly anti-slavery. That left Kansas wide open as a big question mark, and as a result, both pro- and anti-slavery activists flooded into the territory, with both sides hoping to turn the whole popular sovereignty thing to their advantage. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of conflict as the two factions traded blows. This ushered in what was called Bleeding Kansas, something that I have touched on previously in other episodes. Between the years of 1855 and 1859, at least 55 people were killed there in Kansas due to outbreaks of violence between these two factions. This is the same time that the abolitionist John Brown rose to prominence. He and his group actually dragged at least 5 men out of their homes and killed them. Now, he eventually would lead his failed raid on Harper's Ferry and get executed, which just kind of elevated him to martyr status among the anti-slavery faction. Eventually, Kansas ended up adopting a free state constitution, which led the pro-slavery forces in the U.S. Senate to deny them statehood. It wasn't until the southern states started seceding that Kansas was finally admitted to the Union in 1861, just 3 months before the Civil War began. By the way, speaking of Kansas, according to Clint Eastwood, there's 3 types of suns in Kansas: sunshine, sunflowers, and sons of bitches. Bonus points if you know what movie that's from. And don't forget about Missouri either. Missouri was a slave state, but its population, much like that of Kansas, was divided big time on the issue. And while the Confederate States of America would claim Missouri, the state did officially remain as part of the Union. Their Confederate government was actually living in exile in Texas, and over 100,000 Missourians answered the call to fight for the United States during the Civil War, as opposed to just around 40,000 who served in the Confederate Army. Missouri was a hotly contested border state, and as such, both the Union and Confederate armies maintained a presence there during the war. When it comes to them in Kansas, it was truly brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. If there was a more divided area of the United States at this time, I'm not aware of it. It was amongst all of this craziness, all this political turmoil, this divisiveness over slavery, that our young Bill Anderson came of age. These were his formative years. And believe it or not, he didn't really exhibit any burning desire to go fight for one side or the other. At least not that I could find. Like I mentioned earlier, his family weren't slave owners. But one thing is for certain, Bill had quickly become a fan of making that dollar. Ever since he lost that freight that he was supposed to deliver down to New Mexico. When Anderson finally decided to take up arms against the Union Army, he told his neighbors he was doing so for financial reasons rather than loyalty. According to an article I found on history.net, he once said to an acquaintance, quote, "I don't care any more than you do for the South, but there's a lot of money in this business." End quote. Now, I don't know what he meant by this business or how he planned on making money by joining up with the Confederates, other than maybe he was planning on continuing his shady horse trading with them. Or he could have possibly had more nefarious ambitions, as there were guerrilla groups popping up all over the place, robbing civilians blind. And yes, I did find sources claiming that Bill Anderson and his brother did operate such a gang prior to any involvement with the Southern cause. One way or another, Bill Anderson, his brother Jim, and a family friend by the name of Arthur Ingram Baker, aka Judge A.I. Baker, all took to riding together. And at some point in 1861, possibly while en route to enlist in the Confederate Army, they were attacked by some Union soldiers. Now, this Judge Baker guy was about 15 or so years older than Bill Anderson, and a well-known and respected figure in that part of Kansas. He had been a territorial legislator, a judge, a postmaster, and even a justice of the peace. And he was a businessman as well, operating a store somewhere between Agnes City and Council Grove. And here's where things get a little confusing, but I'll keep it short and sweet. At some point, Judge Baker and the Andersons got crossways of each other. There's a whole lot of versions about what happened, but they all pretty much agree that at some point, Bill and Jim Anderson and their little group, along with Judge Baker, ended up getting attacked by some Union cavalrymen, like I just mentioned. Bill and his brother were able to escape, but the good judge was taken prisoner. And for whatever reason, the judge ended his association with the entire Anderson family shortly after being released by Union authorities. If he hadn't been an ardent abolitionist before being captured, he now was. Now, the theories as to why the judge and Bill Anderson had a falling out vary, ranging from the judge just simply choosing to distance himself from a suspected horse thief to Baker going so far as impregnating and then spurning Bill Anderson's 15-year-old sister, ditching her to go marry some other woman. Whatever happened, it would eventually lead to several killings. Shortly after Baker's marriage, somebody went on his property and stole a few horses. The judge was convinced that Bill was the culprit and filed a warrant for his arrest. This didn't sit too well with Bill's daddy, William. Remember him? He paid Barker a visit in May of 1862, shotgun in hand, and called the judge out. Baker responded by shooting William Anderson deader than hell. Oh boy, here we go, finally getting all Wild West up in Chia. Young Bill quickly buried his father and then temporarily fled the state. He'd return a little over a month later, though, and confront the judge. He and his brother Jim, along with 2 other men, surprised Baker at his store and opened up fire on him, forcing the judge to flee to the cellar. They then locked him inside that same cellar and set the store ablaze, attempted to burn the man to death, something they definitely would have accomplished had Baker not just gone ahead and taken his own life. Bill and his accomplices then stole the rest of Judge Baker's horses and rode east towards Missouri, where they'd continue to do more robbing and killing if the stories told are to be believed. Okay, so that's one version. Another very different version from a guy named Paul R. Peterson, the author of the book Quantrill of Missouri,
states that Bill's father was labeled as a Southern sympathizer, something that caused some Kansas Jayhawkers to pay him a visit one day while Bill and his brothers were gone. The Jayhawkers lynched William Anderson, stole the family's possessions, and burned the farm to the ground. 2 days later, according to Mr. Peterson, Bill Anderson was riding with William Quantrill's guerrillas, saying, quote, "I have chosen guerrilla warfare to revenge myself for wrongs that I could not honorably revenge otherwise. I lived in Kansas when this war commenced. Because I would not fight the people of Missouri, my native state, the Yankees sought my life but failed to get me. They revenged themselves by murdering my father and destroying my property." End quote. As you can see in this version, there's no mention of any Judge Baker. So which was it? Are the stories of Bill Anderson and his father being horse thieves just fabrication? Lies made up to discredit this son of the South and sully his good name? What about Judge Baker? We know he existed, and we know that Bill was blamed for his death. But did Anderson really kill him? If so, was he avenging his father or even his sister's honor? And how did Anderson's father really die? Is it true that if you don't use it, you'll lose it? So many questions. The end result was the same. Judge Baker was dead and Bill Anderson was in Missouri. From what I found, though, it does not appear that he immediately joined up with William Quantrill. Looks like he started his own gang and was actually rebuked by Quantrill after robbing some Southern sympathizers. And by rebuked, I mean that Quantrill took Anderson's horses and warned him that any further trouble would result in his prompt execution. This allegedly caused a little ill will and forced Anderson to avoid Quantrill's area of operations for a little bit at least, until he finally joined up with the guerrilla leaders sometime in early 1863. So, who the hell was this Quantrill guy? Well, I'm glad you asked. A native son of Ohio, just a few years older than Anderson, William Clark Quantrill had actually been a school teacher before the war. Spent some time in Indiana and then headed on to Kansas territory at the age of 19, so around the year 1856. Just when bleeding Kansas was really popping off. A couple of years later, Quantrill worked as a teamster for the Army, a job that took him all the way west to Salt Lake City, where he developed a fondness for playing poker, as well as a little bit of stealing and killing. Eventually, he fled Utah after a warrant was issued for his arrest. Came back home to Kansas and started kind of going back and forth between teaching school and offering quote-unquote protection to farmers. Interestingly enough, Quantrill actually taught school in Lawrence, Kansas, a town we are definitely going to talk a little bit more about coming up here shortly. In the years leading up to the Civil War, it appears that William Quantrill changed his mind quite a bit as far as the politics of the day went. As a younger man, he opposed both slavery and the Democratic Party, going so far as saying that Democrats are, quote, "the worst men we have, for they are all rascals." But by the year 1860, he had changed his thinking, proclaiming that slavery was a right and declaring his disdain for men like James H. Lane, a Northern sympathizer whom he once highly respected. He also took to hunting down runaway slaves around this time. In 1861, Quantrill spent more time out west with a guy named Joel Bryan Mays. Now, Mays was a mixed heritage man who ended up becoming a chief among the Cherokee. During the Civil War, Mr. Mays attained the rank of captain in the Cherokee Mounted Volunteers and ended up schooling Quantrill on guerrilla warfare tactics. Together with Mays and the Cherokee, William Quantrill served under Confederate General Sterling Price at the battles of Lexington and Wilson's Creek, before heading on over to Missouri and forming his own group that had come to be known as Quantrill's Raiders. And this would be the group of fighters that Bloody Bill Anderson would join in 1863. In May of that same year, Quantrill, with Anderson in tow, led the Raiders in several attacks across the border to Kansas, where they held up and robbed a store a few miles outside of Council Grove, Anderson's old stomping grounds. They were pursued and confronted by a large posse, and while several of the Raiders were killed or captured, Anderson and Quantrill were both able to elude the pursuers, basically by splitting up into little groups and taking various routes back to Missouri. By the way, Bill Anderson was not initially very well liked among Quantrill's men, believe it or not. When he first arrived, the Raiders considered him a tad on the cocky side, and he was put under the direct command of George M. Todd. Now, this Todd guy, roughly the same age as Anderson, was originally from Canada, having moved to Kansas just a few years prior. And while his father was a respected man, George was said to have been sullen with a bad disposition, rarely speaking to anyone or having any close friends. People who knew him never truly understood why he took to riding with Quantrill, as he had no grievances or wrongs to avenge, nor property to protect. Whatever his motivations, he quickly attained the rank of one of Quantrill's top lieutenants. But then again, so would Bill Anderson, who didn't waste no time climbing the ladder. Wasn't too long before he was conducting and organizing raids of his own. He, just like George Todd, was still operating under the umbrella of Quantrill's Raiders, but would also have several fighters serving under him. one of which was a dead-eyed 17-year-old killer by the name of Archie Clement. Another was a young man you may have heard of, a 19-year-old Frank James. And they, just like Quantrill and just like George Todd, were guerrilla warfighters, also commonly referred to as bushwhackers. And no, believe it or not, the bushwhackers were not an all-female bowling team, nor was it the name of a seedy lesbian bar. No, in all actuality, these so-called bushwhackers were kind of the southern 1860s version of the kids from that movie Red Dawn. Now, I know that's kind of a stretch, but it's the best analogy I can think of. Even though the bushwhackers were fighting on the side of the Confederacy, or at least claiming to, they weren't officially enlisted in any army, nor were they formally trained. But they would become lethally effective. I found a great definition for guerrilla warfare on the website CIA.gov, of all places. And I know I have at least one Special Forces guy listening, so you can skip over this part, man. Pretty sure you've already got it covered. For the rest of us, the definition reads as follows. Paramilitary operations conducted in enemy-held territory by irregular forces, often groups indigenous to that territory. Lacking the numerical strength and weapons to oppose a regular army in the field, guerrillas avoid pitched battles. Instead, they operate from bases established in remote and inaccessible terrain, such as forests, mountains, and jungles, and depend on the support of the local inhabitants for recruits, food, shelter, and information. The guerrillas may also receive assistance in the form of arms, medical supplies, and military advisors from their own or allied regular armies. The tactics of guerrillas are those of harassment. Striking swiftly and unexpectedly, they raid enemy supply depots and installations, ambush patrols and supply convoys, and cut communication lines, hoping thereby to disrupt enemy activities and to capture equipment and supplies for their own use. Because of their mobility, the dispersal of their forces into small groups, and their ability to disappear among the civilian population, guerrillas are extremely difficult to capture. And there you have it. That about sums up Bloody Bill Anderson and Quantrill's Raiders to a T. These guys were not regular army. They didn't wear the gray uniform of the Confederacy or march onto the battlefield with fife players and a little drummer boy. They fought more like Native Americans. Quick raids, ambushes, get in, hit them hard, get the hell out. And they did have some very strong support among the local Missouri population. As such, they had plenty of hiding places. This support system also worked as extra eyes and ears for the raiders. Let them know exactly where the Union soldiers were located and what their movements were. The U.S. military quickly caught wind of this and started arresting civilian family members of known guerrillas, people they thought were aiding and abetting the enemy, including Bill Anderson's sisters. These young ladies were thrown inside a rackety-ass 3-story building in Kansas City, along with a whole lot of other suspected female spies, and the building collapsed, killing one of Bloody Bill's sisters, Josephine. She was just 14 years old. Bill's other two sisters, Mary Ellen, age 16, and Janie, age 10, were severely injured as well. Now, officially, this was an accident. The soldiers, to make more room, had removed some posts that the center girder supporting the second floor rested on. Needless to say, the building then began to sag and cracks started to form. Instead of, maybe evacuating all the damn little girls being held prisoner there, some genius instead decided just to send a soldier over to inspect it, which supposedly is what he was doing when the building collapsed. Fun fact, the building once stood on Grand Boulevard between 14th and 15th Streets in Kansas City, where the Sprint Center now stands. I happened to check out the upcoming events at the Sprint Center, and it looks like if you act now, you can still buy tickets to see Justin Bieber perform there on June 16th. Now, I don't know which is worse, being an orphan political prisoner at the age of 14 and dying because some old-ass building collapses on you, or having to spend eternity haunting a building full of Justin Bieber fans. Either way, I think it goes without saying that Bloody Bill and the rest of the Raiders didn't much believe in accidents. They felt like the building was purposely destroyed by the hated Kansas Jayhawkers. And make no mistake about it, whatever Bill Anderson's original reasons for joining up with Quantrill, whether it was to avenge his father or not, there was now no doubt at all. He would be fueled from this moment forward by the urge to avenge his sisters. As far as the Kansas Jayhawkers go, in case you're not familiar, they were basically doing the same thing as Quantrill's Raiders, only in the name of the Union. The term Jayhawkers was initially a nickname for the 7th Regiment Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, but over time it became a blanket term used to describe any Union troops from Kansas who were operating in Missouri, especially the ones conducting so-called punitive operations against civilians, like Bloody Bill's sisters. These Jayhawkers did their fair share of looting and pillaging and burning and killing. You're probably familiar with the raid on Lawrence, Kansas, which we're getting to very shortly. Well, the Jayhawkers did pretty much the same thing to the town of Osceola, Missouri, in September of 1861, just on a lesser scale. It was an unsanctioned attack that saw the town burned down and 9 of its citizens executed. By the way, man, the poor civilians in Missouri really took a beating during the Civil War. I'll touch more on this throughout this episode, but whew, I know there were horrible things that happened elsewhere, like Sherman's March to the Sea, but I can't help but think you just did not want to live in Missouri during this time. Another, by the way, I'm going to reference the movie The Outlaw Josie Wells a few times. If you haven't seen it already, well, that's on you. You've had over 40 years, buddy. So, consider this a spoiler alert. Clint Eastwood plays as Josie Wells, a member of Quantrill's Raiders. Matter of fact, Bloody Bill Anderson even has a role in this movie, portrayed by John Russell, who in typical Hollywood fashion was 55 years old, playing a damn 20-year-old. No big deal, though. It was just a tiny, tiny little part. Anyway, in the movie, Josie Wells' arch enemies are these guys called the Redlegs. In real life, depending on who you ask, the Redlegs were a secret Union military society numbering at around 100 men, and organized in late 1862 by General Thomas Ewing and James Blunt for, quote, desperate service along the border. They were not the same thing as the Jayhawkers, but both groups are sometimes lumped in together. Not that it mattered to Bloody Bill Anderson. Jayhawker, Redleg, or just plain old blue-bellied Yankee, he'd be more than happy to kill them all just the same. This was especially true after Bill's sister was killed. Her death and the imprisonment of the other civilian women was actually one of the main motivators for Quantrill and his men to attack the Kansas abolitionist town of Lawrence. Icing on top of the cake was that Lawrence was also home to James H. Lane, the man who I mentioned earlier that Quantrill had once greatly admired. Now, I have to confess that I had never heard of Lane before researching this episode. His name popped up so much that I feel like I should mention him at least briefly. James Henry Lane was a veteran of the Mexican-American War who would go on to become a Union general and senator. And he was also a militia leader there in Kansas, commanding a brigade of Jayhawkers known as Lane's Brigade. The great pathfinder General John Fremont and friend of Kit Carson ordered Lane to, quote, make a demonstration along the Kansas-Missouri border, an order that Lane carried out by pillaging and burning. It was he and his men who sacked Osceola. Before that, they burned down the village of Morristown. Once again, the outlaw Josie Wells. Remember at the very beginning when Josie's farm is burned down and his family gets killed? This was a portrayal of Lane's attack on Missourians. James Lane is also mentioned in the vastly underrated 1999 movie Ride with the Devil. Anyway, it wasn't just the Southern sympathizers who had a problem with General Lane. His own commanders recognized that he was doing more harm than good. That for every house that Lane burned down, he was just turning more and more people against the Union. People like Bloody Bill Anderson. So the attack on Lawrence was several things. It was revenge for the sisters of Anderson and all the other civilians targeted by the Jayhawkers. By the way, Bill was not the only one of Quantrill's raiders who lost a loved one when that building collapsed. Lawrence was also revenge for the sacking of Osceola and all those farms that Lane and his men destroyed. And finally, it was a targeted attack to kill Lane himself. Also, maybe, just maybe, the raiders could do a little bit of pillaging of their own, okay? So it was that at the ass crack of dawn on August 21st, 1863, that upwards of 400 guerrilla fighters under Quantrill and Anderson descended upon Lawrence, Kansas, like something out of the Book of Revelations. According to John McCorkle, who rode with the raiders that day, the order was given to shoot every soldier they saw, but not to harm any women or children. Mr. McCorkle also said, quote, a few innocent men may have been killed, but that was not intentional, end quote. One of the first victims was the Reverend Snyder. The raiders caught the minister milking his cow and shot him dead. The townspeople of Lawrence sought refuge where they could. Some, like General Lane, fleeing into nearby fields or ravines. Others taking shelter in root cellars. In almost no time flat, the town was all but destroyed. The bushwhackers ransacked homes, burned down nearly every business, looted and stole what they could, and killed over 150 men and boys. All total, approximately 20% of the male population of Lawrence was killed. And as Quantrill's raiders rode out of town, they left 85 widows behind in their wake. As for Bloody Bill, he was credited with killing 14 people that day, some of which were begging for their lives. His only hint of humanity came when he spared a woman's house after she pleaded with him not to burn it down. And to be fair, I have read some sources that claim that not all of Quantrill's men took part in the indiscriminate killing. That some even stood in front of homes where people were hiding, protecting them. I don't know if this is true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's one thing to sign on to kill Redlegs and Yankee soldiers, but what happened in Lawrence wasn't that. Eventually, Union forces appeared in the distance, and the bushwhackers did what they usually did under such circumstances. The frontier version of dropping that ninja smoke bomb and disappearing. They split up and dispersed in all directions. The only way the Yankees could effectively pursue them was if they too divided their forces. Not a smart thing to do unless you feel like getting your ass ambushed. Only one raider was killed during this entire ordeal, by the way, and he was just a straggler, not having left when all the others did. Word is that after he was killed, his scalp was taken, a practice the bushwhackers under Bloody Bill Anderson would soon adopt. The Lawrence Massacre, as it would become known, led to the issuance of General Order No. 11. This directive forced the evacuation of everyone in 4 counties in western Missouri, no matter their allegiance. If you could prove that you were loyal to the Union, you could stay in the general area, but you still had to abandon your home and take shelter in a nearby designated military outpost. Those who couldn't or wouldn't prove their loyalty just had to get the hell out. This was the largest forced removal of Americans until the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. Now, what this ordinance was supposed to do was deprive Quantrill and Anderson's raiders of all the local support that they relied upon to elude the Union forces. But y'all know how that pesky little law of unintended consequences likes to rear its ugly head. This order went into effect at the end of August 1863 and was repealed 5 months later when General Thomas Ewing was replaced. But so many people were negatively affected that if they didn't support the guerrillas before, they damn sure did now. Not only were they displaced, but their abandoned homes were pillaged. General Ewing, although he ordered his troops not to, was ultimately unable to stop them from looting and burning down all those homes. This affected thousands of civilians. Famed artist George Bingham would say of Order 11, quote, "It is well known that men were shot down in the very act of obeying the order, and their wagons and effects seized by their murderers. Large trains of wagons, extending over the prairies for miles in length and moving towards Kansas, were freighted with every description of household furniture and wearing apparel belonging to the exiled inhabitants. Dense columns of smoke arising in every direction marked the conflagrations of dwellings, many of the evidence of which are yet to be seen in the remains of seared and blackened chimneys, standing as melancholy monuments of a ruthless military despotism which spared neither age, sex, character, nor condition. There was neither aid nor protection afforded to the banished inhabitants by the heartless authority which expelled them from their rightful possessions. They crowded by hundreds upon the banks of the Missouri River and were indebted to the charity of benevolent steamboat conductors for transportation to places of safety where friendly aid could be extended to them without danger to those who ventured to contribute it." End quote. That's some scorched earth type stuff right there. And ultimately, it's a toss-up as to whether or not it did any good. I mean, there damn sure weren't any more raids on the scale of Lawrence after this. And it's probably what caused Quantrill's raiders to head to their winter hideouts in Texas a little earlier than normal that year. But at what price? How many rebels were created by Order No. 11? How many innocent people suffered and just lost everything? By the way, this wasn't the only Order No. 11 issued during the Civil War. General Grant issued one as well, ordering all Jewish people out of the Department of Tennessee. And I'm not joking. From the Mississippi River all the way to the Tennessee River, Jews were banned under the threat of imprisonment. Eventually, President Lincoln himself got involved and revoked the order. I don't know about y'all, but I'm learning all kinds of interesting shit doing this podcast. Anyway, the bushwhackers would pause briefly on their way to Texas to harass some Union forces at Fort Blair, Kansas. Their initial attack didn't do much damage, but the guerrillas were able to surprise another group of soldiers headed to the fort and kill about 100 of them. Now, Bloody Bill and his men were at the rear of this attack, but that didn't stop them from plundering the bodies of all the dead soldiers they came upon. Their bloodlust not yet satisfied, they wanted to make another go at the fort, but Quantrill nixed that idea, an action that angered Bill. Not the first time he and the leader of the raiders would disagree, nor would it be the last. The men set up their winter quarters in Mineral Springs Creek, about 15 miles northwest of Sherman, Texas, within spitting distance of the Red River and Indian Territory. And I didn't know this previously, but it looks like these raiders may have acted as a police force of sorts against cattle thieves who came down out of the territory and raided farms and ranches. Which does kind of make sense. They needed the local citizens there to be on their side. And the locals would have been suffering from a lack of fighting-aged men due to the war, so they needed somebody to help them keep the peace. They were probably ecstatic to have the raiders there for the winter, so long as they behaved themselves. A possibly unrealistic expectation. Quantrill had also had the good sense to report to the proper Confederate authorities and offer up his services. He met with General Henry McCulloch and was soon tasked with helping to round up draft dodgers and deserters. Only problem was that Quantrill's men weren't used to taking prisoners. Instead of rounding up the derelicts, they just simply executed them. Suffice it to say that Quantrill's raiders were no longer asked to do such duties, instead being used on occasion to chase after Comanches. As far as Bloody Bill Anderson goes, he was busy falling in love around this time. Cupid's sparrow. Funny little bird, but he gets the job done. Bill ended up getting married to a Sherman gal named Bush Smith. Weird name, I know, and the more I looked into Miss Smith, the weirder the whole thing got. Her actual full name may have possibly been Mary Irwin Bush Smith. Some sources claim she was a prostitute, while others state that she was a fine, upstanding member of the Methodist Church. To which I propose that these two are not mutually exclusive. And the mystery of Bush Smith will only deepen even after Bloody Bill is gone, and we'll get more into that later. The lovebirds ended up tying the knot in early March of 1864 and lived together very briefly before Anderson would head back to fighting Yankees. Now, supposedly him getting married didn't sit too well with William Quantrill. Why, I do not know. I think tension between he and Bill had just been building ever since they first met back in Missouri, before Anderson was ever even a member of the Raiders. As Bill's status began to rise, so did, it seems, his desire to be Quantrill's equal. Regardless of the why of the matter, this rift would continue to grow until Bloody Bill finally took his men, the ones loyal to him, and parted company with Quantrill. How much of this had to do with the wedding, I don't know. I do know that things got so prickly that at one point there was fear of gunplay between the two factions until cooler heads finally prevailed, at least temporarily. The trouble brewing between these two guerrilla leaders just would not die down, though. Eventually, one of Anderson's men was accused of stealing from one of Quantrill's raiders. The alleged thief was banished and told to stay gone. Well, he didn't. Came back and got himself shot and killed. General rule of thumb to follow is when a hair-triggered bushwhacker, hardened by months of border warfare, tells you to stay gone, just fucking stay gone. Now, this killing ticked Anderson off. He might have even taken it as a personal affront, sort of an insult. If his man needed dealing with, then maybe Quantrill should have let him, Anderson, handle things. Instead, Quantrill took care of it himself. This may have made Bloody Bill look weak to his men, forcing his hand. Either way, it was the straw that broke the Confederates' back. That boil of a grudge that had been simmering ever since Quantrill scolded him back in Missouri in the early days of the war finally came to a head. Bill Anderson took some men and headed into Sherman and snitched on Quantrill. He told a General Cooper of the Army that the guerrilla leader had murdered a Confederate officer. Cooper, in turn, had Quantrill arrested. Okay, here we go. Things starting to heat up now. By the way, it should be noted that by this point the bushwhackers had begun to wear out their welcome there in Texas. There had already been several incidents where civilians living there in Grayson County, where Sherman is located, and neighboring Fannin County, were targeted by the Kansas and Missouri ruffians. So much so that even before Quantrill was arrested, regular Confederate troops had been assigned to protect the area's citizens. Now, being the accomplished sneak attack guerrilla fighter that he was, Quantrill would not stay captured for long. Matter of fact, he escaped the same damn day he was arrested. And guess who the Confederates sent to hunt him down? Our very own Bloody Bill Anderson, the student hunting the teacher. Quantrill still had men loyal to him, though, and these men did engage with Anderson's men, sort of a civil war inside of a civil war, allowing Quantrill to make it safely back to Missouri. As far as the remaining raiders go, they chose the sullen George Todd as their new leader. Long story short, what was once known as Quantrill's Raiders was effectively broken up into three separate groups, led by Bill Anderson, Todd, and Quantrill. Whereas Anderson and Todd were formerly Quantrill's lieutenants, they were now their own independent guerrilla leaders. Although the three organizations would work together in the future, despite the tension. You know, the enemy of my enemy or some such shit. It wasn't too long before Bloody Bill Anderson and his merry band of bushwhackers headed back to Missouri. After all, they did have a war to fight and civilians to rob. If you didn't get robbed by either the Jayhawkers or Anderson's bushwhackers in 1860s Missouri, do you even Missouri, bro? Now, I don't know exactly when it was that people took to calling William T. Anderson Bloody Bill, but if he didn't earn that moniker during the Lawrence raid, he damn sure earned it during the summer of 1864, as he and his men ambushed and raided and scalped their way all across central Missouri. In June of that year, Anderson and about 50 of his men killed a dozen Missouri State militia troops. The next day, they killed 9 members of the Union Missouri Cavalry. By the way, Bloody Bill and his crew would don Yankee uniforms during these ambushes. This is something they'd been doing for quite some time, and it allowed them to get in close without scaring the Union troops. It got so bad that the U.S. military developed hand signals they could use to flash to one another just to make sure they were being approached by allies. Anderson and his men would learn these signals, however, and just keep on killing. And it wasn't just the Jayhawkers and the Union troops that got killed. If you were just a plain old Union sympathizer, that was enough to make you a marked man. And I gotta wonder how much proof they needed before they pulled that trigger. I'm thinking not too much. At some point around this time, Anderson took to calling himself commander of the Kansas 1st Guerrillas and writing pithy little letters to local newspapers. Now, I'm not just going to out and out say that Bill Anderson was a sociopath. He was a young man caught up in the hell of war. I get that. And obviously, just killing people isn't always a sign of mental illness. But writing to a newspaper, however, almost always is. On July 15, 1864, Anderson led his men into Huntsville, Missouri, and robbed the town's depository of over $40,000, roughly the equivalent of $670,000 in today's money. And this tells me two things. One, if my broke ass took all the money I have and went back in time to 1864, I'd still be broke. And two, Anderson, as much robbing and looting as he and his men did, wasn't just in it for the money. With all that money, he could have taken a few of his men and split, headed west or even down to South America with that new bride of his. It wasn't enough for them to live off of forever, but it was enough to get them established somewhere else, maybe start over. That wouldn't be. Bloody Bill Anderson, for whatever reason, had become a true believer in the cause. And I guess his cause was killing Jayhawkers and anybody else he could find who supported him. Before too long, Anderson soon emerged as one of the most well-known and feared guerrilla leaders there in the border country. According to some, even eclipsing Quantrill and Todd. Even the newspapers began labeling Bill as the devil himself, which I'm sure earned them a very strongly worded letter to the editor. Now, all this attention didn't hurt none when Bloody Bill went to recruit new blood to fill his ranks. If you're going to join up with the guerrillas, you're going to join up with the ones with the baddest reputation, right? And that's just what a young man named Jesse James did. Yep, the not quite 17-year-old Jesse James joined up with his brother Frank, who was already riding with Anderson. In late July, Anderson's forces continued doing their thug thing, striking the towns of Rennick and Allen, Missouri, looting and tearing down telegraph poles and killing Union horses. Real guerrilla war type shit. On July 24th, the group killed 2 Illinois cavalrymen, and Anderson himself left a note on their bodies reading, quote, "You come to hunt bushwhackers? Now you are scalped." And he was being hunted, by the way. In just the first 3 weeks of July alone, a Union General Benson Brown sent out 200 separate patrols. And some of them were successful, killing somewhere around 100 bushwhackers. It came at a price, though. They themselves lost men every time they engaged the guerrillas. Make no mistake about it, when pressed, these young killers fought just like cornered animals. On the 30th of July, just a few days after Anderson left that note on those scalped soldiers, he and his men kidnapped the elderly father of a Union militiaman. They tortured the old man nearly to death before letting him go. And at this point, when it comes to Bloody Bill, you're going to start seeing things just progressively getting darker. That facade of being a Southern gentleman is starting to slowly fade under the horrors of war. Just a few days later, things would escalate further as Anderson and some of his men took refuge at a home occupied solely by women. These ladies fed Bloody Bill and his group, but some Union soldiers decided to show up and crash the dinner party. In the ensuing battle, Anderson himself shot and killed one of the women as she attempted to flee the house. Now, say what you will about Bloody Bill's guerrillas, but they didn't take too kindly when it came to killing women. At least not white women. And they straight up let Anderson know that what he did was uncalled for. A rebuke that he sort of brushed off, claiming that it was just an inevitability of war. Further evidence of him more fully embracing the darkness. And it wasn't just him. By this point, his men were even mutilating their dead enemies and torturing the rare prisoners they took. They also began decorating their horses with the scalps of the dead. And of course, they continued skirmishing with Union forces. By August of 1864, those same papers that once referred to Bloody Bill as the devil himself now took to calling him a heartless scoundrel and an incarnate fiend. What they didn't call him was a damn river pirate, but they should have, because that's exactly what he became, for a very short period of time at least. Anderson attacked a dang steamboat on the Missouri River, killed its captain, and took the ship over, using it to attack other boats and just flat out disrupt all traffic on the river. Once back on dry ground, Anderson would hook back up with William Clark Quantrill. The two men passed things up, or at least pretended to, long enough to make a failed raid into Fayette, Missouri in September of 1864. Now, Bloody Bill had already been collaborating a little with George Todd and other lesser-known bushwhacker leaders like John Thrakel and Clifton Holtzclaw. In August, the bunch of them had attacked a wagon train and killed 15 Federals, 3 of which were black soldiers, whose bodies they made it a special point to burn. I guess it offended them seeing the freed black men wearing uniforms. And before you start emailing me, yes, I know there were some black men who rode with Quantrill and his raiders. As far as Fayette, Missouri goes, it was the home base of the Union Army's 9th Missouri Cavalry, and they were really dug in there in Fayette. But still, Bloody Bill was determined. He led charge after unsuccessful charge that saw only 2 Union troops killed and multiple dead bushwhackers before the attack was finally abandoned. Possibly due to Bill's fervent insistence on this botched raid, the other guerrilla leaders decided just to part ways with the man once again. The debacle at Fayette is considered Bloody Bill's greatest failure as a leader, which is interesting because it was quickly followed by one of his single greatest victories. On September 27, 1864, Anderson and about 75 of his men decided to gallop on over to Centralia, Missouri, and see if they couldn't do a little bit of looting. Because why not? They earned it. These men had been selflessly fighting for the cause for years now and, needed to blow off a little steam and terrorize some civilians. No, but I can't help but think that some of them might have felt that way. And it just so happened that Centralia did have a large store of whiskey, which Anderson and his men decided to tap into. They took them a break from all that pillaging and just chilled out in the Centralia hotel lobby and got drunker than Cooter Brown. Just so happened that as they was drinking, a stagecoach arrived, containing two prominent Union loyalists, one a sheriff and the other a dang congressman. Now these two guys got lucky. The bushwhackers didn't know their identity, so instead of killing them and scalping them, they just robbed them. The next arrivals to Centralia wouldn't be so lucky. Just as they were wrapping up robbing that stagecoach, a train pulled into town. Now this was a Union passenger train that contained 23 off-duty and unarmed Union soldiers. Per usual, Anderson allegedly ordered the women on the train to remain untouched as he and his men robbed all the rest of the passengers. He then had the soldiers lined up and executed, all except for one man, a sergeant. He was spared for a potential future prisoner swap. A very unlucky German civilian, a train passenger who just happened to be wearing a blue shirt that day, was killed along with all the soldiers. Bet y'all didn't know people were getting killed over gang colors back in 1860s rural Missouri. After the soldiers were murdered, the train was set on fire and an approaching freight train was derailed. The civilians were released, but under strict orders not to put out any fires or move the bodies of the dead soldiers. And just like that, Anderson and his men departed, whiskey drunk and weighted down by over 20 Union scalps and $9,000 worth of ill-gotten money they stole from Centralia. Important to note that both Frank and Jesse James were present for this incident. And at least one account I found stated that Frank allegedly discovered $13,000 in the train's mail car. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's safe to assume that the James brothers learned themselves a little something about train robbery that day. By the way, it had been less than a month since Jesse had celebrated his 17th birthday. That's crazy to think about. When I was his age, I was just starting my senior year of high school. Hadn't even kissed a girl yet. And here he is, just participated in a war crime. Bloody Bill Anderson and the boys may have left Centralia, but the day's fighting weren't over yet. Not by a long shot. That afternoon, a detachment of the 39th Missouri Volunteer Mounted Infantry, under a Major Johnston, arrived at Centralia and found out what happened. They went hunting Anderson, and it was their misfortune to catch up to him. What followed was a pure slaughter. Bloody Bill and his men swarmed the Missouri Volunteers from three sides, and when the smoke cleared, 125 Union soldiers lay dead. Bloody Bill's most decisive victory to date. And one thing worth pointing out is how heavily armed Anderson and his men were. They fought while mounted on their horses and found it much easier to wield a revolver while in the saddle rather than a rifle. And since they fought hard and fast, they didn't have time to reload. This meant that each of the guerrillas would have several revolvers on them. According to bushwhacker William R. Stewart, who was there for this fight against Major Johnston, quote, "We killed most of them. That was because we were armed so much better than the Federals. Each of us had from 6 to 8 pistols, while the Union soldiers carried only powder and ball muskets." Basically, while the men of the 39th were fixing their bayonets and attempting to reload their single-shot muskets, Bloody Bill Anderson and his bushwhackers just ran straight over them. An accomplishment that caused him to start calling himself Colonel Anderson. And I kind of like that. I think once I start getting like 5,000 downloads per episode, I'm going to start calling myself Colonel Josh. Anyhow, many of the dead soldiers were scalped, just more grim trophies for the guerrillas to hang from their war horses. By the way, according to Frank James, it was his brother young Jesse who fired the shot that killed Major Johnston, or shots, I should say. Jesse's first ball caught the major in the side, bringing the officer to the ground. For the finishing touch, Jesse just leaned over in his saddle and put one square in Johnston's head. Story goes that Jesse James would go on to kill 8 more men that day before the fighting was over. 17 years old. And this ambush would lead to several revenge killings. Outraged Union soldiers began retaliating against Southern sympathizing civilians, killing them the same way that Anderson and his men killed Northern sympathizers. They even went so far as to burn down the guerrilla-friendly town of Rocheport, air quotes on accident, an event that Bloody Bill allegedly watched from a nearby bluff. As Rocheport burned, so did Bill's hatred for the Union, or so legend goes. Once again, I think of that movie Red Dawn. Remember that one character, Robert, carving notches in his gun, and that downed Air Force pilot tells him, "All that hate's gonna burn you up, kid." And then he replies, "It keeps me warm." And then he does that cool little flip with his switchblade. Oh, I love that movie. And I feel like I need to say, anytime I refer to Red Dawn, I am referring to the one and only original from 1984. Not that embarrassing abomination of a remake that they try to pull off. Back to the story. By October of 1864, Bloody Bill Anderson met up with General Sterling Price yet again, a somewhat awkward meeting. Price was disgusted by Bloody Bill's actions, as well as the scalps that decorated he and his men's horses. But at the same time, the general was fighting a war and he felt like he needed Anderson. Sometimes I guess it pays to have somebody who's lacking in the scruples department. General Price ended up promoting Bill to the rank of captain and ordered him to keep disrupting Missouri railroad traffic, an order that Anderson pretty much just ignored as he and his men continued looting. At one point, he rode into a Confederate army camp that had some wounded Union prisoners. Bill decided he'd send them to an early grave, but he was stopped short by some rebel doctors. Gotta wonder how these doctors were able to keep their humanity during this war. You would think they'd be just as jaded, if not more so, than the guerrillas, just constantly surrounded by dead and dying men. Yet these Confederate doctors did the honorable thing, protected their prisoners, even though they were their enemies, from falling into the hands of Anderson and his killers. I think that's admirable, no matter which side you're on. Shortly thereafter, Anderson and his men would head to Glasgow, Missouri to do some good old-fashioned pillaging, because why not? Whilst in town, Bill paid a visit to a certain Benjamin Lewis, Glasgow's wealthiest citizen. Now, Lewis had the audacity to actually free his own slaves, something that Bloody Bill did not care for at all. Decided to teach the man a lesson by beating the living hell out of him, trampling him with a horse, and then stealing all of his money. Still not satisfied, Anderson would then go on to rape Lewis's servant, a 12-year-old black girl. Before everything was said and done, Anderson and his men killed several more citizens of Glasgow, Union sympathizers they called them, and returned to Benjamin Lewis's home to rape a few more of the rich man's freed servants. I guess the distinction here is that these women were not white, therefore they weren't offered the same reverent respect as the other women that the guerrillas normally left unmolested. And yes, Benjamin Lewis would die the next day from his wounds. If you're paying attention here, you're going to notice this steady decline in humanity. The killings have only increased, and so is the casualness of it all. Scalping and the tortures, to just out and out raping black women. Now, according to history professor and author Matthew T. Hulbert, quote, critics of Anderson's guerrilla career frequently depict him as having been a glorified cutthroat, delusional, paranoid, and even as a full-fledged sociopath. Others point to the dehumanizing effects of guerrilla warfare as an explanation for Anderson's wartime exploits. They posit that he was not the only guerrilla gradually transformed by his Civil War experience, and should therefore not be viewed as exceptionally or uniquely deranged. Okay, fair enough, war is hell. There were men like Bloody Bill Anderson centuries before the Civil War, and there's going to be men like him long after I'm in the dirt. I just feel like Anderson and his guerrillas should kind of be a warning. And not just them, but the Jayhawkers as well. A warning that war should be avoided at all costs. Once we get that ball rolling, it's hard to stop what follows, as you can see with Bloody Bill Anderson. As for him, his time on this earth was quickly coming to an end. Following the attack on Glasgow, a Union lieutenant colonel named Samuel P. Cox was assigned to track down the guerrilla leader with a force of specially trained, experienced troops. And he did just that on October 26, 1864. What followed is sometimes referred to as the skirmish at Albany. Unfortunately, I had a hard time piecing together exactly what happened. What we know for certainty is that Bloody Bill and his men were camped just outside of Albany, Missouri, when Colonel Cox caught up with them. I've read that Anderson was commanding about 300 guerrillas at this time. I also read that he only had 80 men under his charge that day. Yet another account claims 150. As for Colonel Cox, it's equally as confusing. One source said he's the one with 150 troops. Another claims over twice that many with 350 troops. I've also read that they may have lured Anderson's men into an ambush, the same way that Bloody Bill had done so many times in the past, by sending out a small patrol as bait. It looks like it is possible that the guerrilla Bloody Bill Anderson got himself out-guerrillaed. Whatever the exact details, once the two sides started fighting, the violence soon spilled over into the streets of Albany. At some point, Anderson rallied his troops and led them in a charge, but they were turned back due to overwhelming firepower. Finally, two lone men broke from the ranks of the guerrillas and charged headlong into Union lines. These men were John Rains, son of Confederate General James S. Rains, and the man of the hour, Bloody Bill his own damn self. What possessed these two fighters to undertake what I think most of us would consider a suicide mission? I don't know. As one writer put it, it was either an act of reckless bravery or desperation. And believe it or not, the rebel duo were successful in breaking through the Union lines. A very short-lived victory, as Second Slater Bloody Bill Anderson would drop from his saddle with 2 mini balls shot from a Springfield musket lodged in his skull. Dead before he hit the ground, at just 25 years of age. As soon as Bill was identified as the dead man, his body was transported about 90 miles south and paraded through the streets of Richmond, Missouri. They took pictures, and yes, there is a picture of a dead Bill Anderson online if you look for it. He's wearing his fancy ornate guerrilla warfighter shirt, gotta get me one of those, with his revolver clutched in his lifeless hands. As people were wont to do back in those days, they did prop Bloody Bill up outside the local courthouse so that folks could walk by and gawk at him. He was eventually buried in a field outside of Richmond, but not before one of his fingers was cut off to remove a ring. Looks like the Union troops weren't above doing a little bit of looting dead bodies either. Supposedly, I don't know how true this is, but supposedly a cord of silk with knots tied on it was also found on Bill's body. These knots, numbering 53, were said to symbolize all the men that Anderson killed. Now y'all know me, I'm normally on the skeptical side when I do these episodes, at least when it comes to body counts. I think most of the deadly men of the West, as deadly as they were, still greatly exaggerated how many people they killed. I do not think this is the case with Bloody Bill Anderson. I'm actually surprised his count isn't higher than 53. I've covered a lot of killers on this podcast. John Wesley Hardin, Tom Horn, Clay Allison, Deacon Jim Miller. Out of all these guys, I find Bloody Bill Anderson as to be the scariest of the bunch by far. Now, I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think they all suffer from dead souls. There's just something about Bloody Bill that gives me the creeps. His ruthlessness made him one of the most feared of all the guerrilla warfighters of Missouri and Kansas. He taught other notorious killers like the James brothers and Cole Younger how to kill. Anderson claimed that he was doing everything out of revenge, but that noble cause quickly disintegrated into raping and stealing from civilians. Still, though, he is considered by some, even to this day, as being a hero. What do y'all think? Hero or villain? I lean more towards team villain. I'm sure under the right circumstances, Bill Anderson would have been a perfect Southern gentleman, and I do understand that his life was brutally affected by the war. He was driven by revenge, much in the same way that the James boys would seek revenge after the Pinkertons killed their little brother and blew their mother's arm off. But I also still have the controversial viewpoint that war is never an excuse to go around raping and indiscriminately murdering who you please. A lot of people go to war. The vast majority don't resort to rape and murder. But I don't know. Once again, what do y'all think? Hit me up at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com and let me know. Or head on over to bloodybeaver.com and hit that contact button. I am kind of curious to see how this episode is received. Believe it or not, that guy that made the suicide charge with Anderson, John Raines, actually survived. He made it back safely to the guerrillas and escaped with them. As for Lieutenant Colonel Samuel P. Cox, he would become somewhat of a national hero after the war was over, and he moved back home to Gatlin, Missouri, which just so happens to be the location of one of the first James Gang bank robberies. And get this, they not only knew that Colonel Cox lived there, but they thought they killed him. Jesse James mistook bank president John Sheets as Cox and gunned the man down, avenging, or at least he thought, his old mentor Bloody Bill. He wouldn't find out until later that he killed the wrong man, and Sam Cox lived to the ripe old age of 85, dying in 1913. Following Bloody Bill's death, his trusted lieutenant, Archie Clement, took over as the leader of the remaining guerrillas. Little Arch, as he was called, only stood 5 foot tall and weighed 140 pounds. That was 140 pounds of pure killer. Now, a lot of Bloody Bill's men would either go on to just rejoin William Quantrill or just head home, as it was becoming clear to everybody that the Confederacy was lost by this point. Archie Clement, however, would never surrender. He fought on even after the war ended, although the lines between fighting and bank robbery were soon blurred. He and his gang began striking Union-owned banks, a practice that the James Gang would continue. Finally, Little Arch met his end in Lexington, Missouri in 1866. He was drinking when he got approached with an arrest warrant and was told to surrender. He answered this request by drawing his revolvers and fighting like a wild man. He was shot through the chest, but still managed to get on his horse and race through town, before finally being blown out of the saddle. As a detachment of militia approached the dying Clements, he was still trying to fight, attempting to cock his revolver using his teeth. His dying words were, "I've done what I always said I'd do, die before I surrender." He was right around 21 years of age. George M. Todd, William Quantrill's once-upon-a-time second-in-command, was killed during the Battle of Little Blue River in October of 1864, just 5 days before Bloody Bill was killed. Todd was barely 25 years old at the time of his death. As for William Clark Quantrill, he at one point concocted a plan to lead a company of men to Washington, D.C. and assassinate President Lincoln. When this didn't come to fruition, he continued raid into Missouri, oftentimes crossing over into Kentucky. And that's where the Union troops found him, a full month after General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant. He and his band got ambushed, and while trying to escape, William Clark Quantrill was shot in the back and paralyzed from the waist down. But still alive. He was brought by wagon to Louisville, Kentucky, where he would die of his wounds less than a month later. He was just 27 years old. Now, Bloody Bill's brother Jim survived the war and headed back down to Texas, where he may have married Bill's widow, Bush Smith. Remember her? Now, that's a rabbit hole I'll leave for all of y'all to go down if you're interested. Once again, a lot of mystery surrounding this Bush Smith lady, if that was even her real name. She may have been pregnant with Bloody Bill's child when he departed Texas, never to return. And she may have married Jim Anderson following the war. Even Jim's death is pretty mysterious. We know for sure that he did move to Texas with his sisters, where he possibly conspired with Jesse James to murder one of their former guerrilla brothers-in-arms, a guy named Ike Flannery, in order to steal the man's inheritance. In retaliation, another former guerrilla, George Shepard, who just so happened to be Flannery's uncle, caught up with Jim Anderson in Austin, Texas, and cut his throat, right there at the state capitol building in front of God and everyone. Now, as far as I know, this has not been proven. I've also read that Jim wasn't killed at the Capitol building in Austin, but instead at the courthouse in Sherman, Texas. He probably did die in 1871, but as far as I can tell, nobody knows for 100% sure how he died, who, if anybody, killed him, or even where he's buried. 44 years after the death of Bloody Bill, one of his proteges, Cole Younger, would have his body reburied in the old Pioneer Cemetery in Richmond, Missouri. I found this kind of interesting because first Jesse tried to avenge Bloody Bill's death, and then decades later, Cole Younger has his old leader reinterred. By all accounts, the men under Bloody Bill Anderson's command highly respected him. Once again, proving the theory that real recognize real, even if you're just talking about killers. And of course, it wouldn't be the Wild West if we didn't have somebody claiming that Bloody Bill Anderson did not die at the hands of Union soldiers. That he faked his death and lived to be an old man, because fuck it, we love our fairy tales. In 1927, an article was published claiming that an 84-year-old Brown County, Texas man, William Columbus Anderson, known as Uncle Bill Anderson, was actually the Bloody Bill Anderson. Is there any truth to this? Well, that just depends on how you want to spin things in your own mind. You can follow this Brown County Anderson's paper trail all the way back to the Civil War. You can find him on the census records. You can see where he enlisted and served 20 days in the Confederate Army in 1864. You can see him and his brother's names listed on tax records in Brown County, Texas a year prior in 1863. Surely there's no way he was also in Missouri leading a band of guerrillas, right? Well, the same thing could be said about a certain Oliver Roberts, aka Brushy Bill Roberts. But that doesn't stop a whole hell of a lot of people from believing that he was Billy the Kid. So I'm going to leave this one up to y'all.
Texas wasn't much of a home for Cullen Baker. Few liked him, and some even tried to kill him. Yet after 3 hard years of wandering, he's come back to farm the land that's rightfully his. Only thing is, Cullen's in for an unwelcome homecoming. His neighbors have long memories, the Reconstructionists have greedy hearts, and his worst enemy is teamed up with a vicious outlaw. But Cullen isn't about to back down. Instead, he's intent on perfecting a new way of gunfighting, the fast draw. And now, with enemies closing in on 3 sides and threatening the woman that he loves, he'll have to be faster than lightning and twice as deadly just to survive. Or so reads the back of Louis L'Amour's novel, The First Fast Draw, a highly fictionalized account of the notorious Cullen Baker. But sometimes the truth is much, much stranger than fiction, and a whole lot bloodier. Said to have killed hundreds of people, although the true number is likely far less, Cullen Baker was one of the more deadly men of the Old West. A guy who didn't blink when it came to dropping that hammer, and a man to whom killing seemed to come naturally. Who was Cullen Baker? A proud rebel who continued to defy federal authority long after the Civil War was over? A true hero of the cause, or just a homicidal maniac? Did he really invent the quick draw? And what's up with that story about him carving a life-sized effigy of his dead wife? Cullen Montgomery Baker was brought into this world on June 22nd, 1835 in Weakley County, Tennessee.
Father John Baker would move the family first to Arkansas and then to Red River County, Texas, before finally settling there on the Sulphur River in present-day Cass County, Texas. Now, Cass County's way up there in northeast Texas, right along the western borders of Louisiana and Arkansas. A rich farmland with a very large slave population, at least at that time. The citizens of Cass County were staunchly pro-Confederate when Cullen was coming of age. So much so that they actually temporarily changed the name of the county from Cass to Jefferson Davis in honor of the Confederate president. I only mention this because the Civil War, the events leading up to it, and its direct aftermath would be the defining event in Cullen Baker's life. I mean, that's part of the mystique surrounding the man, right? That he was an unreconstructed rebel, a true believer in the Southern cause, helping to protect his homeland from a tyrannical, occupying military. That said, the Civil War wouldn't begin until Baker was in his mid to late 20s. And as it turns out, he was prone to violence well before he swore allegiance to the Stars and Bars. The sandy-haired, blue-eyed Cullen seemed to be trouble-prone from a very early age. Once the victim of bullying himself, a teenage Baker snapped and struck out against his tormentor, beating the older kid to within an inch of his life. According to legend, he probably would have killed him had others not intervened. After this, young Cullen seemed to always be on the prod. He had a hair-trigger temper and was ready to throw down at a moment's notice. Couple that with a strong taste for hard liquor, a taste acquired at a very young age, and the citizens of Cass County soon had a problem child on their hands. It does appear, however, that Baker was humbled a bit at the age of 18. Humbled and likely forever altered. By this point in time, it would have been around 1853. Baker, despite still being wet behind the ears, could be found on any given day drinking his fill at various local watering holes. And it was in one such establishment that he finally bit off a little more than he could chew. Evidently, another patron had quite enough of this young brash pup and decided to teach him a lesson, striking Cullen over the head with a tomahawk. Now, this wasn't no love tap. Matter of fact, it almost put Baker under, and he was out of commission for a while. Story goes that this blow to the skull even caused him to stick to the straight and narrow for at least a little bit. Not sure how much that had to do with him being reformed as opposed to not being able to stop seeing double. Either way, he did calm down long enough to get married in January of 1854, still wearing bandages around his head at the ceremony as he and young Mary Jane Petty swapped vows. And you know how the rhyme goes. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes, that's right, murder. A few months after Cullen and his bride tied the knot, he went and killed his first man. Remember, we're still talking 1854 at this point, several years prior to the war between the states. Seems that Baker, now a bully himself, took to harassing a young orphan, a child by some accounts, and when that wasn't enough to satisfy his cruelty, he took up a bullwhip and began striking the youngster. A good, honest bystander by the name of Wesley Bailey witnessed this assault and encouraged the young victim to go to authorities, which he did, pressing charges. Cullen was arrested and forced to stand trial, but I was not able to determine what his punishment was. Likely just a slap on the wrist, if anything at all. And strangely enough, Cullen lashed out not at the orphan who told on him, but at Wesley Bailey, the man who encouraged the kid to seek justice in the first place. In Baker's warped mind, I guess he figured the man was sticking his nose where it didn't belong. And it wasn't too much longer before Cullen paid a visit to the Bailey farm, double-barreled shotgun in hand. Upon seeing a drunken and heavily armed Cullen Baker, who already had a bad reputation as a bit of a hothead, Wesley Bailey quickly jumped behind a post of some sort to shield himself. The irritated Baker then told Wesley that he didn't intend to kill him, just wanted to wound him a little bit. "Come on, what do you think I am, some sort of psychopath? I just want to shoot you in the legs and see you jump. But if you keep hiding like that, I'm going to get mad and shoot you in the dang head." Now, I am paraphrasing, but not by much. That's actually the gist of what happened. Seriously. All Cullen claimed he wanted to do was wound the frightened Bailey in the legs and watch him quote-unquote jump. And Wesley, probably scared out of his wits, fell for it. He exposed himself, and sure enough, Cullen let him have both barrels of that scattergun, literally shredding Bailey from his knees all the way up to his midsection. Miraculously, the wounded man didn't immediately die. He hung on for 3 or 4 days, naming his killer, before he finally gave up the ghost. Not that Cullen was trying to deny anything. He let it be known that, yeah, I shot Wesley Bailey, but I didn't mean to kill him. I was just fooling around, having fun. Fooling around or not, nuttier than a squirrel turd or not, Baker wasn't just going to wait around on no hangman's noose. He took his wife and headed some 200 miles northeast to his uncle's place in Perry County, Arkansas. Now, this murder, I couldn't find an exact date as to when it occurred, other than about 8 or 9 months after Baker was married. So figure August or September of 1854. And in the spirit of transparency, I will say it was not easy finding a lot of exact dates or particulars surrounding the entire life of Cullen Baker. This is one of those episodes where the timeline might get a little bit skewed. I did have a hard time connecting all the dots, but I'm hoping I'm not too far off point. If you're an expert on all things Cullen Baker and I get anything wrong, by all means, please contact me, josh@wildwestextra.com. As to what Cullen did to occupy his time in Arkansas, your guess is as good as mine. He and Mary Jane would have a daughter in May of 1857, and I believe I found them on the 1860 census, still there in Perry County with Baker's occupation listed as farmer. And evidently Cullen didn't leave his anger issues nor his penchant for hard drinking back there in Texas. A lady in Arkansas decided to speak her mind about Cullen's antics one day, and he paid her a visit with a bundle of hickory sticks, meaning to give her a nice little ass swatting. Because that's what you do when women say things you don't like, right? Naughty girls get the switch, don't they? Who's the naughty girl? Who's the naughty girl? All right, sorry. As you can imagine, the woman's husband, David Wortham, didn't take too kindly to this. He and Baker started tussling right there in front of the house, with Wortham quickly getting the upper hand. His wife at one point began to scream, distracting David just long enough for Cullen to pull out a blade and sink it into the man. He soon bled out, and once again, Cullen Baker became wanted for murder. Unfortunately, Cullen's wife Jane passed away in June of 1860, and Baker would take his then 3-year-old daughter back to Texas, where he'd leave her with the in-laws, or former in-laws. Not sure how much contact father and daughter had after this, but according to more than one source, he never saw the girl again. That killing I just described a moment ago, the stabbing death of David Wortham, I was not able to determine whether or not it occurred before or after Mary Jane passed away. It's entirely possible that being a married man was the only thing keeping Cullen somewhat restrained, and upon his wife's death, he just went even further mad. Without giving too much away, you will see this happen again later on with Baker's second marriage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, we're still pre-Civil War, but not for long. The escalating tension between the North and the South had finally come to a head. In February of 1861, Texas seceded from the United States and joined the Confederacy. And you better believe Cullen Baker wasn't going to sit this fight out. He enlisted with Company G of Morgan's Regimental Cavalry out of Cass County in November of 1861. Guess the Army wasn't too big on checking to see if prospective recruits were wanted for murder back in them days. Now, it appears that Morgan's cavalry was primarily operating in the Trans-Mississippi region as part of Parsons' brigade. And during Baker's time, I don't think they saw much action other than marching the hell all over Arkansas. I actually have a book on another lesser-known Confederate unit, the 28th Texas Cavalry, and they were much the same, at least early on during the war. Texas to Arkansas, a lot of waiting around camp and marching, and then more waiting. Boredom and sickness seemed to be their main adversary, at least in the beginning stages of the war. Cullen would take a brief leave of absence in July of 1862 to get married a second time to a gal from Lafayette County, Arkansas, named Martha Foster, but he soon returned to his unit. He could be found on roll as late as October, but in January of 1863, he took another leave, this one permanent and unsanctioned, as he would be listed officially as a deserter. Not real sure on the motivation here. Like I touched on a minute ago, I don't believe Morgan's cavalry was seeing much fighting during this time, if any, so I don't believe it was a fear of battle that caused Cullen to go AWOL. If anything, I think it might have been the regimented discipline coupled with the unmitigated boredom of regular military life that he didn't care for. Also, there are scant references to him being assigned as an overseer to a slave work detail during this time, and him killing one or two of the black men before deserting. So I suppose fleeing military justice could have been another possible motivation as well, but I just have no proof whatsoever to back that up. My apologies. I feel like that's getting to be the case more and more with some of these episodes. There's just so much mythology built up around some of these guys, and the resources we have are a bit lopsided. In Cullen's case, one of the men he tried to murder on more than one occasion ended up writing his biography. Reckon a few details might have been embellished on that one, and we will talk more about that later. Once again, what happens next is a bit murky. Some sources claim that Cullen returned to his wife in Lafayette County to take up farming before finally being overcome by the wanderlust. Others claim he joined up again with the Confederates, this time with the 15th Texas Cavalry, but only served for a brief period before being mustered out due to some sort of disability. Following this discharge, and sometime in early 1864, Cullen was said to have been captured by a so-called lawless group of bandits who, upon seeing that he was of no threat to them, recruited the wayward man into their ranks. At least that's the way the story goes. Here's what we do know. By 1864, Cullen Baker was serving the Confederate cause once again, but I do use the term serving very loosely. He was riding with a group there in southern Arkansas called the Independent Rangers, who were somewhat associated with the Confederate Home Guard. Now, the Home Guard is an organization I've personally never read anything good about. While I'm sure there were some decent and kind men among them, I'm just not aware of it. Originally designed to replace the various state militias now fighting with the regular Confederate Army, the Guard's purpose was to defend the home front. They also spent a fair amount of time hunting down Confederate deserters and draft dodgers. The first thing that comes to mind to me, if you've ever seen the movie Cold Mountain, the bad guys, the ones that are terrorizing Nicole Kidman and her neighbors before Jude Law shows up, that's the Confederate Home Guard. Now, I know that was just a movie, but history does show that such outfits often resorted to a similar type of lawlessness. With the majority of able-bodied men stationed elsewhere, the Home Guard was free to do basically as they pleased. And sometimes what they pleased was robbing, raping, and killing. If someone had property that these groups like the Independent Rangers wanted, they'd simply declare the family as Union sympathizers and take it. If there was a man around to cause trouble, guess what? Now he's a Union man or a deserter, and well, we execute them around these parts. Don't get it twisted, you had scoundrels on both sides. One such group in Arkansas, the Mountain Boomers, were Union-associated guerrillas committing mostly the same sort of atrocities as Cullen Baker and the Independent Rangers. Naturally, the two entities clashed, but mostly they went after much softer targets. Like a group of civilians attempted to flee the hell of war-torn Arkansas in November of 1864, who had the misfortune to encounter Cullen Baker, who, by this point, was leading the Independent Rangers. The civilians, mostly women, children, and older folks, were attempting to cross the Saline River in the Ouachita Mountains when the Rangers intercepted them. Baker considered them leaving Arkansas to be a cowardly and unpatriotic act, or at least that was his excuse, and he ordered these prodigal travelers to turn around and head back across the river. When they refused, he drew his revolver and shot and killed their leader. He then told the rest that if they'd cross back over, he'd let them go. They did as they were told, and Cullen and his men promptly butchered 9 more, most of which were elderly men. And of course, they then made off with any valuables at hand, which I'm sure was their main motivation to begin with. This blatant act of violence, known as the Saline Massacre, did finally cause some of the locals to somewhat rise up and make plans to get rid of these transgressors, but the so-called Rangers skedaddled as soon as they got word. Guess fighting other armed men didn't much appeal to them, unless they were black, and especially if they were black and had the absolute gall to don the uniform of a United States soldier. Oh boy, that really got them worked up. Cullen actually encountered one such group on the Red River town of Spanish Bluffs, Arkansas, toward the end of 1864, either shortly before or shortly after the Saline Massacre. Baker was drinking in a saloon, as was his habit, proudly wearing a gray Confederate cap, when some black soldiers showed up asking for his ID, which he gave them in the form of a loaded 6-shooter. When the smoke cleared, a sergeant and 2 or 3 of his companions lay dead on the ground. Another story about Cullen that makes the rounds states that he murdered a black lady around the same time simply because he didn't like the way she looked. Supposedly, he came upon a group of wagons, noticed the lady, and began verbally harassing her before he finally just shot her dead. Is that true? I have no idea. Sounds a bit apocryphal to me, almost like the story about John Wesley Hardin killing a man because he was snoring too loudly. Then again, when it comes to both of these guys, these stories sound like something they would do. Whether or not the events actually happened, I'll let you decide. Remember, when it comes to Cullen Baker, there are some that claim he killed hundreds of people. Others say around 50 or 60 is a more reliable number. I personally think that's still a bit too high. That said, Baker was a deadly man who had very little regard for human life, and in the areas we're talking about on this episode, there was a lot of indiscriminate murdering of innocent people. So it could have happened. But hell, my grandma could have been a coal miner if she had balls. Could have don't count for much when you're talking about history. All right, so these Independent Rangers kind of disbanded towards the end of the war, especially after losing local support after that massacre, and the ever-increasing presence of Union troops. It's said that Cullen settled down for a bit, joining up with his wife Martha and operating a line ferry on the Sulphur River there in southern Arkansas, but sadly, she would not have long to live. Baker became a widower once again when Martha passed away on March 1st, 1866, causing him to lose what marbles he had left. Turns out Baker wasn't too bad when it came to the art of whittling, and he was even known to carve out little detailed animals, squirrels, rabbits, and such. And when Martha died, he whittled or carved a life-sized effigy of the woman, like some big morbid wooden scarecrow, dressed the thing up in Martha's clothing and kept it inside their home, even adorning it with her jewelry. Yikes. And one day, or so the legend goes, Cullen came home only to find his property had been vandalized by federal soldiers, the jewelry missing and a picture of his dearly departed used as target practice. Now that's enough to cause even the mildest of us to lose our cool, right? Not to mention someone as loony as Cullen Baker. You know he went on the prowl, and he did quickly find 18 soldier boys camped nearby, and he, along with a friend, killed almost all of them. Once again, is this true? I highly doubt it. I feel like there would be some sort of official record when it comes to the murder of over a dozen federal troops in one sitting, especially in peacetime. With that said, did Union soldiers ever show up at the Baker cabin and ransack it while Cullen wasn't home? Possibly. I mean, he was a wanted man, and following his wife's death, his reputation as a killer only continued to grow. Now, by this time, Reconstruction was in full swing, both in Arkansas and the Lone Star State. Just a real quick refresher on Reconstruction. This was a brief period following the Civil War where the United States was pretty much trying to rebuild itself. The main goal was to bring the southern states back into full political participation in the Union, as well as guaranteeing the rights of the former slaves. In the eyes of many Texans, however, this was akin to a foreign military occupation. Not only had they lost the war, but now their enemy was camped right there on their doorsteps, trying to tell them how to live. The fear was that the northern carpetbaggers and corrupt Union officials would rule by brute military force and take whatever they wanted and leave all the good, honest citizens to ruin. It didn't help none that many places like Cass County, where Cullen grew up, or Lafayette County, Arkansas, his most recent home turf, were hit pretty hard economically before Reconstruction even began. According to the Texas State Historical Association, in 1859, Cass County, Texas, slaveholders had paid taxes on 4,700 slaves valued at over $2 million. This represented 60% of all taxable property in the county. The loss brought about by emancipation, together with the widespread belief that free blacks would not work and the uncertain status of the South and the nation, led to a loss of confidence that caused property values to further plummet in 1865. This is where the belief that Cullen Baker was a hero starts to come into play. The idea that Union officials seized his land as well as the property of others, thus turning him into an outlaw and forcing his hand to continue the war against Northern aggression. A war that, if we're completely honest, he never really participated in the first place. Unless you count chasing deserters and killing innocent civilians. Truth is, there's no real evidence of Union troops abusing their powers, at least not in Cullen's neck of the woods. By the war's end, you had Union troops stationed in previous Confederate strongholds like Lafayette County, Arkansas, or Bowie County, Texas. You also have bluecoats stationed in nearby Marion and Harrison counties and a Freedmen's Bureau in Marshall, Texas, about 40 miles to the south. As far as Cass County goes, Union troops were never stationed there at any time. Once again, per the Texas State Historical Association, U.S. military commanders removed Cass County office holders as impediments to Reconstruction. Reconstruction, however, was of a short duration in the county, and the county was soon returned to white Democratic control as early as 1869. So other than that, and having some Union troops occasionally passing through while traveling or pursuing fugitives, the county remained untouched. Unlike other Texas counties, the citizens of Cass County, for the most part, did not experience the military occupation by a conquering army. Furthermore, the total number of U.S. troops stationed in the entire state of Texas was quickly reduced from 50,000 down to just 3,000, with most of them stationed on the frontier. I'll be 100% transparent here. I'm no great expert on Reconstruction. It does appear to me, however, just from what little I've read, that in the parts of the South we're talking about today, on this episode, Northeast Texas and Southwest Arkansas, the largest impact was economic. And that economic impact was mostly brought on by the loss of property, human property, slaves. This was not, once again, at least not that I could find, a situation where the federal army showed up and started seizing homesteads or looting and burning and taking stuff that didn't belong to them. By far, the vast majority of innocent civilians in this area being targeted at this time, the ones who took the brunt of all the violence, were the recently freed slaves. I actually found a letter sent by the Freedmen Bureau out of Marshall, Texas, detailing just 1 month's worth of violence. Every single day, one or multiple free slaves were simply gunned down, murdered, and oftentimes the local authorities refused to even arrest or prosecute the killers. Freedmen Bureau Inspector Colonel William H. Sinclair, upon inspecting Northeast Texas, said freed people and white unionists were living in, quote, pandemonium itself, and that the conditions were deplorable. Blacks continued to work under conditions he said were worse than slavery, and he witnessed firsthand outlaws under indictment or wanted, guys like Baker, who just rode in and out of towns as they pleased. Big shout out, by the way, to Michael over at Texas History Lessons. I picked his brain a bit on Reconstruction here in Texas, and he sent me a wealth of information that I have yet to read all of. It's going to take me a while to do that. Speaking of Texas History Lessons, if you haven't done so and are hankering for some more Wild West content, check out his most recent episodes on the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. I know I touched on that briefly way back when I did my Quanah Parker episode, but Michael really hit it out of the park on this one, and his source material is straight from the point of view of the great Billy Dixon. Link in the show notes. All right, so given everything I just said about Reconstruction, why did Cullen Baker continue to fight? What was the great insult heaped upon him that gave him no other recourse but to resort to violent retribution against the evil United States military? I got no fucking clue. And I say he continued to fight, but what he really did was continue to kill. His hatred for the Union Army and everything they represented remained intact. Make no mistake, that was genuine. But he wasn't exactly out there waging no one-man war of resistance, nor was he simply trying to live a quiet, peaceful life. He would surround himself with like-minded cutthroats, kind of like in his independent ranger days, and begin committing various crimes, working out of the river bottoms there in southern Arkansas and northeast Texas. And just a quick aside, I know I keep saying southern Arkansas and northeast Texas. Unless you're familiar with the areas I'm talking about or you're staring at a map, it may sound like Baker is making all these long journeys all the way from Texas to Arkansas and back. That is not the case at all. Bloomberg, Texas, where Baker often frequented, was only 5 miles away from another one of his favorite haunts, Bright Star, Arkansas. Just wanted to point that out. He was literally right there on the border. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that this is not your classic Old West terrain. We're not talking about the high desert or wide open rolling prairies or even snow-capped mountains. That little corner of northeast Texas is heavily wooded, covered in thickets and swamps and river bottoms, and mosquitoes. Plenty of places in there to disappear or have someone disappeared. Its people can be clannish and prone to feuds, even nowadays, but that's just East Texas in general. A good portion of the border along the Sabine River was often referred to in those days and earlier as no man's land. And another area that Cullen would sometimes frequent to the west was sometimes called the Devil's Triangle. Imagine a line drawn from Grayson County in North Texas down to Navarro County, and then east to Cass County, and then back west to Grayson. That'll give you a rough triangle of about 13,000 square miles, where in addition to Cullen Baker, you had more outlaw gangs led by other ex-Confederates, men like Benjamin Bickerstaff and Bob Lee. To quote James Smallwood, Kenneth Howell, and Carol Taylor in the aptly named book The Devil's Triangle, quote, during the war, those men, Cullen Baker, Bickerstaff, and Lee, lived with violence and destruction, and they brought that violence and destruction to northeast Texas when they returned home. They refused to accept the judgment of war. They caused death and chaos wherever they went. While their major interest was plunder, such men wrapped themselves in the Confederate flag, voiced support for the lost cause, and gained much support from former Confederates. End quote. Now, I think that about sums it up. You know, all three men were ex-rebels. They all knew each other. All three rode together on occasion, and yes, all three were stone-cold killers more interested in plunder than anything else, despite what the popular narrative might be. I did a little reading on both Bickerstaff and Lee, as they really piqued my curiosity. These are the type of guys that I would have never known about had I not started this podcast. It's cool because I love learning about more obscure characters, but it is a bit of a curse because I'm easily distracted. So I'm exercising my self-control by not going down a Bickerstaff and Lee rabbit hole right now. Just know that they were fellow bandit leaders, all with stories similar to Cullen's. They were tolerated for a bit and even praised by locals as long as they talked up the Confederate cause and didn't get too crazy stealing from certain families. But all good things come to an end. Let's just say their lifestyle didn't exactly lend itself to making it to an old age. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the man of the hour, Mr. Cullen Baker. In March of 1866, he got into a fight with some Union soldiers in the town of Boston, Texas. And just like his previous fight with those black soldiers, Cullen was quick to draw his revolver, killing a sergeant by the name of Albert Titus and catching a bullet to his own arm in the process. This really got the Army's attention and they put a bounty on Baker's head, dead or alive. The wily Confederate proved to be a slippery eel, however, and quickly disappeared in those river bottoms of swamps, and nobody, especially not no damn Yankees, could sneak up on him. Not that he didn't stick his head out now and then and cause some trouble, like the time in June of 1867 when Cullen decided to go shopping. Yes, believe it or not, even the most bloodthirsty of outlaws need to get groceries on occasion. Man cannot live on hate alone. As it were, Cullen stopped in at Rowden's General Store there in Cass County, but Mrs. Rowden was the only person manning the ship on that particular day. I guess Baker either wasn't in the paying mood or he didn't believe in giving cold hard cash to females because he simply gathered up what supplies he wanted and walked on out. Or maybe he figured the Rowdens were good Southern patriots who'd be more than happy to support a gentleman like himself. I don't know. Once the proprietor, John Rowden, found out what had happened, he came calling and told Baker to his face that he aimed to collect on these goods. It should be noted that Mr. Rowden didn't go out to meet Cullen with nothing but high hopes and well wishes. He went hild, scattergun in hand. Now, I don't know how the conversation went exactly. I don't know whether or not John was asking all nice-like or if he employed a little bit of thunder to his voice. But Baker did agree to come into town soon with the money. And to his credit, he did return to the general store a few days later on June 5th. Only instead of money, he carried a shotgun of his own and a belly full of whiskey. He called Rowden out, and once the man appeared, he ended his life with a double-barrel blast to the chest. By late August of that same year, Baker was arrested but quickly escaped, likely with the help of locals or possibly even the arresting officials themselves. I was unable to find more details on that. And 2 months following this, he let the Yankees know he was still alive and kicking by robbing one of their supply wagons outside of Jefferson, Texas. If you heard the episode I did on Texas gunman Bill Longley, link in the show notes, he was said to have been a part of that particular action. This is one of those Robin Hood type situations where Baker attempted, probably successfully, to garner some goodwill among his neighbors. The supplies in the wagon, bacon, flour, stuff like that, were spread out among locals, and once distributed, Cullen simply set the empty wagon on fire. If anything, the seizing of these supplies was just a big middle finger to the Union authorities. Now, I don't know about you, but it can get lonely doing nothing but stealing and killing. Remember, Baker was only human, and it wasn't long before he got himself a hankering for some female companionship, of the permanent sort. Decided he'd get hitched again, and who better to marry than Belle Foster, the 16-year-old sister of his dead wife, Martha. As you can imagine, neither Belle nor her parents, Billy and Elizabeth Foster, were very keen on the idea. Not sure if it was the fact that Cullen was a wanted killer, or almost twice her age, or, I don't know, had a life-size wooden carving of her dead sister. But Belle noped the hell out of that courtship real quick. Gotta think that wooden effigy probably wouldn't have gone over too well on their wedding night. Kind of hard to consummate a relationship with the dead beady eyes of a huge doll dressed in your sibling's clothing staring daggers at you. Unless you're into that sort of thing. No judgment. No, instead, Belle chose to marry a local school teacher named Thomas Orr. Now, Thomas was a little bit closer to Belle's age. He was only 23, compared to her 17 years when the two finally tied the knot in September of 1867. And to be fair, Cullen Baker actually took this rejection with a surprising amount of maturity. Not only did he offer to pay for the wedding, but he also had a small home constructed for the newlyweds, as well as a new schoolhouse there in Bright Star, Arkansas, where young Thomas worked. And of course, that's not true at all. No, fucking crazy. Baker began relentlessly harassing Thomas, showing up at the schoolhouse and berating the man and cursing him in front of his students, laughing at him, trying to bully him into a fight. He even went so far as to hit Orr over the side of the head with a damn branch. And that was just the beginning. Things are about to ramp up real quick between Mr. Orr and Baker. but not before Cullen decided to join an angry mob, hell-bent on instructing a fellow white man not to be so damn nice to the freed slaves. It seems Baker was drinking at a Bright Star Saloon. This was in December of 1867, when a bunch of locals were getting butthurt over a farmer named Hal Smith. It seems Smith had the audacity to actually hire some free slaves. The angry mob's numbers grew, as did the amount of liquor they poured down their gullets, until finally they had enough courage to pay Hal Smith a visit. Cullen Baker right there with them. Only thing was, this Hal Smith guy wasn't about to take no mob justice laying down. Not to say that things didn't get sideways. The vigilantes ended up stabbing Smith's daughter during the attack on his farm, as well as killing a black man, who I assume was one of Hal's new employees. Smith put up one hell of a fight, though, and wounded several members of the mob, including Baker, who took a slug to the leg. After this, Cullen kinda sorta went on a little bit of a killing spree. First on the list was a man named William G. Kirkman, who made the mistake of becoming an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau in Boston, Texas. He's the guy who wrote that letter I mentioned earlier detailing the crimes committed there against some of the freed slaves. So from what I can gather, the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to assist formerly enslaved people to obtain land, jobs, fair treatment, education, as well as help settle disputes and complaints, assist in legalizing marriages entered into during slavery, and providing transportation to refugees and freed people who were attempting to reunite with their family or just relocate to other parts of the country, blah, 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 blah. You know, all that Yankee basic human rights shit. How dare they, you know? You mean to tell me that the damn carpetbaggers just decided to come waltzing down to Texas with these big ideas of freedom and equal rights? Cullen Baker and his people were just supposed to be like, oh, okay. I don't think so, buddy. Long story short, Cullen came riding into town and just flat out gunned Kirkman down. The Bureau official was said to have gotten off one shot before he was riddled by 16 separate shotgun and pistol balls. 2 days later, Baker murdered a couple of freedmen. No details nor motive known, other than the obvious. And next on the kill list was a guy named John Salmons. The gang Baker was running with, he was basically co-leading it with another bad man named Lee Rames. Rames had a brother named Seth, also an outlaw who went and got himself killed by the aforementioned John Salmons guy. Needless to say, Cullen and the boys snuffed out his lights as soon as they found him. Then they went after another guy named George Barron, who at some point had helped a posse search for Baker. One after another, the bodies began piling up. Back in Arkansas, Cullen was recognized by Union authorities when boarding a ferry. At first, he tried using an alias, but when that didn't work, he simply jerked iron and began firing. One sergeant was killed, with a private being able to get away and alert authorities. In October of 1868, even more soldiers would be killed there in Arkansas. A Major P.J. Andrews and a Lieutenant H.F. Willis, along with an unnamed black civilian. Remember, this is over 3 years after the war officially ended. I can find no additional details to these killings, but evidently Sheriff Standell of Little Rock, Arkansas was also wounded, so I assume they were attempting to arrest Cullen. A couple months later, Baker killed a black dude named Sheffield, who had been bragging that he would lead people to Cullen for the right amount of money. When Cullen caught up to the man outside of Queen City, Texas, just 20 or so miles south of Texarkana, he filled him full of so much lead that Sheffield was said to have been, quote, shot to jelly. Then, as a bit of entertainment, Baker would gallop his horse and jump over the dead man's body, using his head for target practice. Fun times. As you can imagine, with somebody as volatile as Baker, most people, even his own gang members, were scared shitless of the man. This was not the case for co-leader Lee Rames, however. The two men got crossways over something. Some sources claim it was Baker's increasing recklessness, and Lee called Cullen out, challenged him to a fight. And for the first time that I'm aware of, Cullen Baker backed down. Guess he did have at least a little fear of death in him after all, even if it meant losing face. Following this altercation, the rest of the boys stayed with Lee Rames, save for one, the ever-loyal Matthew Dummy Kirby. He alone would continue to ride with Cullen and pay dearly for it. And yes, you heard me correctly, the man's nickname was Dummy. At first I thought he was some sort of a deaf mute, but it turns out he was just an asshole who was really good at imitating and making fun of deaf mutes. Really wish I knew more about that Lee Rames guy, though. I have no idea what became of him, what his real story was. So if you do know any information, please shoot me an email at josh@wildwestextra.com. Remember Thomas Orr, that young school teacher who wed Belle Foster, Cullen's wife's sister? Well, Baker had forgot that great insult, and he figured it was time to make things right. Cullen paid Thomas a visit in the dead of night, kicking in his door and tying the man up along with his former father-in-law, William Billy Foster. Next morning, he released Foster but put a noose around Orr's neck and lynched the man. Only thing was, the school teacher survived. Guess Cullen had a little bit too much whiskey the night before and didn't do a thorough job, or maybe he was just in a hurry. Upon realizing his mistake, Baker returned to the area again a few weeks later on January 5th, 1869. He showed up at his daddy-in-law's house again with dummy Kirby and claimed to simply be in the area to tie up a few financial loose ends. Just so happened Thomas Orr peeped Baker through a window and quickly snuck out the back to go fetch help. In the meantime, Cullen and Kirby helped themselves to some of Foster's whiskey along with what victuals he had lying around. And by the next morning, both men were dead, their bodies perforated with bullets. How they got that way is up for debate, as there are 3 different versions of what had happened. What else is new, right? One story goes that Cullen and Dummy got themselves good and drunk and laid down to take a nap. Thomas Orr arrived with a couple other guys, and the 3 just unloaded their weapons into the sleeping outlaws. The end. Another version has William Foster taking part in the killing by lacing all that whiskey and food Baker was consuming with strychnine. And it was the poison that actually did the job. Then, just to be thorough, Orr and his buddies, along with Foster, pumped both men's bodies full of lead. And then you have version number 3. Orr returned with several armed neighbors who were tired of Cullen's bullshit. According to one Texas paper at this time, quote, "They were determined to kill him, Baker, or sacrifice their lives in the attempt," end quote. This version is kind of backed up by a potential witness, a black dude who went by the name of Doc Quinn. In the book Slave Narratives, A Folk History of Slavery in the United States, Volume 6, Doc states that he was about 50 yards away from the Foster house when Thomas Orr and his friends rode up. Cullen and Dummy were standing outside near the chimney and were caught completely by surprise and gunned down before they even knew what was happening. I will say I have read some of the other stuff Doc Quinn said about Baker, and it's a bit dubious. Just reading his account of Cullen's death and his description of Cullen, the man sounds a little bit like Steven from Django Unchained. Whatever actually happened, I think a lot of people in that neck of the woods had one long collective sigh. At 34 years of age, the bad man was gone. Cullen Baker would murder no more. His body and the body of Kirby were both taken to nearby Bloomberg and dragged through the streets before making the 40-mile trip south to Jefferson, where they were put on public display. And it's there in Jefferson, in the Oakwood Cemetery, where you can still visit the grave of Cullen Baker. And oddly enough, if you happen to be in the area during the first week of November, you can join in at the festivities at the 46th annual Cullen Baker Fair up in Bloomberg. Thomas Orr, that meek school teacher who finally did Baker in, probably, would live another 35 years, dying in the year 1904 at the age of 60, 1 year after his wife Belle passed away. Orr was the one who actually wrote that book on Cullen, titled The Life of the Notorious Desperado Cullen Baker, that you can still find on Amazon. This is one of those be very wary of the source kind of situation. I mean, how fair or unbiased could you expect the man to be after getting tormented and strung up by Cullen? According to Orr's book, Baker recruited the guy I mentioned a moment ago, Doc Quinn, to help lure other black people to their death under the guise of forming an all-black militia. Using this trick, Baker is said to have killed 53 freedmen at Holman, Arkansas, 86 at Rocky Comfort, Arkansas, 6 at Ogden, 62 near Jefferson, Texas, 100 in northern Louisiana, and 73 outside of Marshall, Texas. Not sure if you were keeping score at home, but that's nearly 400 people. An outrageously inflated number that I don't think even gets close to being accurate. Do I believe Cullen likely murdered some freedmen in such a fashion, luring them to their deaths? Sure, just not no 400. I don't buy that he killed hundreds of men, period, black or white. He certainly killed his fair share. That's not up for debate, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than a couple of dozen. That's killings directly by his hand or the hands of men that he led. But hundreds? There's just very few people in history who ever racked up that kind of body count, even in wartime. When it comes to Cullen Baker, he's one of those you either love him or you hate him kind of guys. On one side, you got people that believe he was a Confederate hero, a man defending the honor of the South after being occupied by an invading army looking to strip Texans of their rights. On the other hand, you have those who think he was nothing more than the living embodiment of the KKK, a snarling monster who roamed East Texas looking for black people to devour. Likely the truth is somewhere in the middle. The Civil War was pure hell, and it changed everyone who participated, and their families. I have a very hard time believing anyone came home from that conflict the same as when they left. And for some, the war was simply just an excuse to exercise their bloodlust. I think this is probably the case with Cullen Baker. We know he was a killer before the war, and although his various murders are hard to track, he didn't really participate in any actual battles that I'm aware of. He and his independent rangers went after soft targets, the weak, the old, or they killed from ambush. And I can't fault them there, I suppose. And you can't forget that knock on the head that Cullen took when he was still a teenager. An injury like that will have lifelong repercussions. We now know, thanks to science, that head trauma can cause permanent behavioral and emotional issues, up to and including the frontal lobe's capacity to govern impulsivity or self-control. I think it's safe to say that Cullen Baker was a bad man. He was impulsive, dangerous, and a killer. As I've alluded to, there are several sources that claim Baker killed the majority of his victims from ambush, that he only engaged in violence when he had the upper hand. While I don't doubt he was prone to such precautions, we also do know there were at least a few times he simply threw caution to the wind and got jiggy with it, like the times he killed those soldiers. Baker, in my opinion, is one of the scarier guys I've ever covered on this podcast, and not necessarily due to his body count. It's the insanity and just a total sense of unpredictability. Other than that time he backed down from his fellow outlaw Lee Rames, there's no indication that Baker was ever really afraid of anything. And a man who doesn't know fear is a nerve-wracking son of a bitch. You just never know what they're going to do. As for Baker being the first fast draw, I don't think there's any basis for that other than the title of Louis L'Amour's novel. And I'm not knocking Louis L'Amour. I love his stuff, but he was a fiction author. And the first fast draw is a fiction novel that just so happens to use the names of some real people. The real question is whether or not Baker was deadly because he was so quick with the gun, the actual physical motion of pulling a revolver, thumbing back the hammer, and squeezing the trigger, or was he deadly because he was quick to go for his gun, that he wouldn't hesitate to resort to a very final form of violence. Remember what Gene Hackman said in the movie Unforgiven? Being quick with a pistol, that don't do no harm, but it don't mean much next to being cool-headed. A man who will keep his head, not get rattled under fire, likely as not, he'll kill you. And then that dime novelist asks, but if the other feller is quicker and he fires first, Hackman cuts him off, then he'll be hurrying and he'll miss. Man, I love that movie. And not to keep harping on movies, but then you got John Wayne in The Shootist. It isn't always being fast or even accurate that counts. It's being willing. I found out early that most men, regardless of cause or need, aren't willing. They blink an eye or draw a breath before they pull a trigger. I won't. And I think that's what it came down to with Cullen Baker. He didn't blink an eye nor draw a breath. When he saw a threat, he simply started killing, and I think the people who he engaged with weren't ready for such a swift, violent response. It's worth mentioning that a few months before his death, on August 27th, 1868, Major General J.J. Reynolds, the guy in charge of the military districts for the state of Texas, issued Special Order Number 16, in which he offered a reward of $1,000 for the delivery of Cullen and the two other Northeast Texas outlaws I mentioned previously, Bickerstaff and Lee. Obviously, Baker would only last another 4 months and some change. Bickerstaff was next, meeting his end 3 months later in April of '69 when he rode into the town of Alvarado, Texas, looking to cause trouble. The townspeople rose up and blasted the man straight to hell. Bob Lee quickly followed, May of '69. He was balls deep in the Lee-Peacock feud and the only one of the three to die at the hands of the U.S. military. I definitely want to cover this Lee-Peacock feud more in the future. There's still lots more to be said about both Lee and Bickerstaff, just not today. Okay, well, I guess that's about all I've got on Cullen Montgomery Baker. What do you think? Did I get it right, or am I just falling victim to revisionist history? I'll tell you this much, the older I get, the less and less patience I have for the so-called lost cause doctrine. As a Texan born and raised, as someone whose direct ancestors fought for the Confederate States of America, why sugarcoat it? Things weren't great. The South lost the war, and bad things did happen. That doesn't mean that the people living in the South are bad. That doesn't mean that your great-great-great-grandma was a mean old lady. It simply means that bad things happened, and it's okay to acknowledge the bad right along with the good. You can pick your friends, you can pick your nose, but you can't pick your family.
an old adage that the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, knew all too well. Every family has that one black sheep, right? Or maybe you're like me and you're the black sheep. In the case of the Truman clan, that shameful distinction fell on James John Chiles, a.k.a. Jim Crow Chiles, Harry's uncle by marriage. A violent Missouri bushwhacker described by author David McCullough as universally hated and the stuff of children's nightmares. And believe it or not, Chiles got the nickname Jim Crow due to his talent as a dancer. Minstrel dancing, to be precise. That's M-I-N-S-T-R-E-L, not to be confused with the minstrel dance your wife does once a month as she frantically decides whether or not to hug you or just murder you in your sleep. Seems that back in the 1830s and 40s, there was a popular white entertainer by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice who performed a song and dance routine in blackface while mimicking African Americans. This persona he put on during the act was known as Jim Crow. Dude went on to tour all over the country, even in Europe, and it weren't long before Jim Crow was just a common phrase used to describe all white comedians who did these degrading blackface type performances. And of course, years later, the term would be adopted as the identifier for the laws reinstating white supremacy in the South. And apparently, Truman's uncle was one hell of a Jim Crow dancer. Not exactly the type of association you'd want to have as a politician, right? Even in 1945 when Truman was elected. Oh, and don't worry, it gets much, much worse. Uncle Chiles' comedy routine was the least of the future president's worries. Born in Jackson County, Missouri in 1833, James Chiles, like many of his bushwhacking counterparts, got his start as a man-killer long before the war between the states began. Jim's daddy was James C. Chiles, a veteran of the Seminole and Mexican-American Wars, and two-time Missouri state senator. In 1856, holding the rank of colonel, the pro-slavery Elder Chiles led a group of Missouri fighters at the Battle of Osawatomie, over in Kansas, clashing with John Brown and his bunch. It's thought that Jim Crow Chiles, already in his early 20s, almost certainly participated in this action. And then, in 1859, the then 26-year-old Chiles killed his first man, that we know of at least. Some poor bastard that made a casual, loose remark in regards to Jim's less than admirable table manners. Chiles would be charged with murder, but seeing as how his family were prominent landowners, he would get off scot-free. Jim married Truman's Aunt Sally that November, and shortly thereafter embarked on a trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico. As it turns out, despite having a violent temper, Chiles was apparently a half-decent wagon master. As such, he made numerous trips west, especially to California, where, according to one source, he owned the original land grant where Stanford University now stands, about 40 miles south of San Francisco. Be that as it may, Chiles' wife Sally just flat out refused to move any further west than Independence, Missouri, and that was that. Reckon she didn't have no issues relocating in a southerly direction, however, as the pair, along with their infant child Elijah, would move some 400 miles south to Sherman, Texas in 1861, where Uncle Jim Crow would open up a gambling hall/saloon. Now, if you listen to the episode I did on Bloody Bill Anderson, link in the show notes, or if you just have a passing familiarity with the Missouri guerrillas, you likely recall that they did use the town of Sherman as a place to spend the winters. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine when James Chiles first became associated with either Bloody Bill Anderson or Quantrill, although I did find a hint that possibly William Quantrill served as a bullwhacker on a wagon train led by Henry Chiles, Jim's brother. So perhaps they did know each other before moving to Texas. Matter of fact, I think that's probably likely. Either way, it does appear that Jim Crow's migration to Sherman was a family affair, as his parents and other relatives made the move with him. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, the elder Chiles would ultimately be buried there in Sherman at the time of his death in 1883. Now, like I said, Jim Crow Chiles operated a hotel/saloon/gambling joint right there in Sherman, which also served as a home for he and his kinfolk. Rumor has it that it was Chiles' own saloon where Bloody Bill's wife, Bush Smith, worked before that scoundrel made an honest woman out of her. Chiles also established a horse track, with a little help from William Quantrill, to serve as a bit of amusement for his fellow bushwhackers. To be honest with you, I'm not overly brimming with particulars when it comes to Jim Crow's whereabouts or actions during the war, and what little info I have is a bit conflicting. He apparently did keep his saloon open during the course of the war and, per legend, even killed a couple of folks down there in Sherman. Both incidents were said to be over gambling debts. And most sources do seem to agree that at some point Chiles returned to Missouri with Quantrill's raiders before signing on with General Joseph Shelby's forces. While Jim Crow would participate in the massacre at Lawrence, Kansas,
and on 2 separate occasions have his horse shot out from under him. He was also said to be more or less a hanger-on of the Bushwhackers, as opposed to a 100% true blue full-time guerrilla. Then again, yet another source from 1894 describes Chiles as a, quote, king among the Bushwhackers. So make of that what you will. If the stories are true, by the close of the war, Chiles was still riding under the flag of General Shelby, as he would accompany the Iron Brigade into Mexico rather than surrender to the U.S. military. If this sounds familiar, maybe you've seen the movie The Undefeated starring John Wayne. Shelby planned on joining up with Emperor Maximilian, but things just didn't work out, and by the fall of 1865, Jim Crow Chiles was back in Texas to gather his family. He and Truman's then very pregnant Aunt Sally, along with their now 2 children, then relocated back to Independence, Missouri. And there are 2 different narratives when it comes to the life of Jim Crow Chiles post-Civil War, one of which seems to be very firmly planted in the myth of the lost cause. Story goes that Chiles had his property foreclosed on by them mean old carpetbaggers, forcing him to open up a seedy saloon just to make ends meet. And sure, maybe he continued to kill people right there in Independence, but as was the case with all good Southern gentlemen, these killings were always justifiable. What's more, not only was Jim Crow a good father and loyal husband, but his benevolent kindness even extended to his former slaves. Chiles treated them so well, in fact, that they chose to remain living with he and his family even after they were set free, as is evidenced by the 1870 federal census. Now that's the fantasy version of Jim Crow. The view likely held by them who also think that Bloody Bill Anderson was a God-fearing man, simply defending his homeland against the oppressive northern aggression. In reality, Chiles was meaner than hell and a damn holy terror as far as the good people of Independence, Missouri were concerned. Crow boasted that he held the entire town under his thumb, and he would walk about with a swagger, 2 heavy Colt dragoons sticking out of his breeches, a couple of derringers stowed away just in case, and often with a very large bullwhip in his hand, which he used to torment the local black populace. Jim was also said to work as sort of a treasurer for the Bushwhackers, helping to store their valuables and money for them. That being the case, he is thought to have murdered fellow guerrilla Tom Jones in order to keep the man's belongings. Chiles did claim self-defense and said that Jones was trying to steal his horse, but it is widely believed that Jim lured the man to his home with premeditated plans to just commit cold-blooded murder. When drunk, which was apparently often, Chiles would mount his horse and ride around Independence looking for freed slaves to beat with his bullwhip. And he even killed 2 in cold blood, pumping them full of lead just to see him jump. All total, it's said that Jim Crow Chiles killed 9 men. I'm assuming that's as a civilian outside of his service during the war. And by 1873, he was still under indictment for 3 murders. Enter in Independence Assistant Marshal James Peacock. Oh boy, this is where things get really good. Trust me, you're going to want to stay tuned for this. I guarantee you've never heard of a fight quite like the one coming up. Real quick though, this episode is brought to you by... Alright, welcome back. Now that marshal there in Independence, James Peacock, he first came west at the tender age of 17 and volunteered for the Mexican-American War, ironically serving in the same unit as Jim Crow's daddy. Peacock fought in several engagements, including the Battle of Chihuahua, Yo Quiero Taco Bell, before heading to California as one of the many 49ers hoping to strike it rich. And once the Civil War began, the nearly 40-year-old Peacock decided to sit that one out. A somewhat strange choice considering that nearly everybody served one way or the other, and I have no idea as to the man's motivation, but maybe he figured that he had already done his part down in Mexico. As you'll soon hear, it certainly weren't a lack of nerve that stopped James Peacock from once again marching off to war. He would serve as the marshal for Independence twice, and it was in that capacity that he and Uncle Jim Crow had their rendezvous with destiny. As far as I could tell, Chiles had the entire damn town buffaloed. He pretty much did as he pleased, and nobody ever stood up to him. On the fateful day in question, September 21st, 1873, Chiles was roaming the streets as usual, thoroughly liquored up, and just asking for a fight. Around 2 p.m., he attacked a man named Sampson, who, just like everybody else, was too scared to even defend himself. Guess Chiles found his unresponsive prey boring, so he went hunting for someone a little more lively, maybe someone with enough sand to make a fight out of it. And that's when he spied Marshal Peacock, standing at the door of Sullivan's Dry Goods. Now, this was back in the day when normal, healthy men carried around walking canes just for the hell of it. I guess it was fashionable. Then again, as we have heard on more than one occasion here on the Wild West Extravaganza, a walking cane does come in handy when you're looking to give someone a good pop nod upside their head, which is what Jim Crow almost got. As it were, his wounds would end up being far worse than a simple strike from a walking cane. Peacock and Chiles greeted each other with a few grown-up words, and Jim Crow slapped the lawman across the face, a blow which the marshal countered by attempting to strike the Confederate upside the head with that cane of his. In the course of just a few seconds, the pair fell to the sidewalk and pulled iron, both of them still holding on to one another with their free hands. The marshal's 23-year-old son, Charles, upon seeing that his daddy was in trouble, rushed to his aid and put a bullet in Jim Crow's side. But the guerrilla continued to struggle. And what's more, he had a son as well, Elijah, who, believe it or not, was just a week away from his 13th birthday. He rushed in to help his father as well, and somehow, securing a revolver of his own, shot Marshal Peacock in the back right about the same time that the good marshal decided to put a ball squarely under the left eye of Jim Crow Chiles. Oh, but the fight ain't over yet. As the senior Chiles is slumping to the ground dead, young Elijah and the marshal's boy Charles began emptying their pistols at one another. Charles Peacock took a round through the thigh, but was still able to squeeze off a fatal shot that struck 12-year-old Elijah under his left arm. Both James Peacock and his son would recover, with the marshal living all the way to the ripe old age of 89, and Charles passing in 1933 at the age of 83. By the way, James never did have that bullet removed from his back. Or at least that's according to the March 26, 1907 edition of the Kansas City Journal, which also stated that the then 83-year-old James Peacock was still working, employed as a police judge, and that the job was his for as long as he was able. As for Jim Crow Chiles and his boy Elijah, they were buried next to each other the following day there in Independence at the Woodlawn Cemetery. It's said that upon the demise of Jim Crow, the relieved citizens of Independence let out cheers and began throwing their hats up in the air in celebration. Got to assume that old Harry Truman didn't talk about his uncle that much come election time. Speaking of Truman, it is worth mentioning that the president and Chiles never did know each other, as Truman wasn't even born at the time of Jim Crow's demise. He did grow up there in Independence, though, hearing the stories, and there were plenty of stories to go around when it came to the various deeds and misdeeds of Uncle Chiles. Also, lest anyone accuse me of being one-sided, it needs to be said that not everyone regarded Jim Chiles as a monster. First off, don't let the thumbnail for this episode confuse you. That's not him. He was described by many as being a very handsome guy. Obviously, he was an agile dancer, was said to have been highly respected in Sherman, and very well known for his hospitality, taking in many a refugee from Missouri. When the Leavenworth Times broke the news of Chiles' death in 1873, they also offered up a somewhat balanced view of the man. While the article does describe Jim Crow as a desperado who exercised his terror over the town of Independence, and while doing so, killed several men, they also added the disclaimer that Jim's violent side only emerged when he was excited or in anger. The article then goes on, quote, "At other times, he was a whole-souled gentleman, and his misfortune was a violent, uncontrollable temper and a will to pull the trigger at the slightest offense. He has hundreds of friends in this country who will mourn his death exceedingly." End of quote. There are also conflicting accounts as to whether or not Jim Crow's son Elijah had his own pistol or whether he picked his daddy's up off the ground and then just continued the fight. I did read one account that stated young Elijah had to place his father's revolver between his knees just to cock it. As to the theory that Chiles treated his slaves so good that they just continued to live with him even after emancipation, I do think this is a topic that very much needs to be treated with nuance. Sure, I guess it's possible that despite the many tales of Jim Crow Chiles terrorizing and or killing other freed black men, maybe he did choose to treat his former slaves with kindness and generosity. Or maybe it's more likely that given his history and reputation, these people either feared for their lives if they dared to leave, or were just made somehow dependent on Chiles. Much like an abused wife who has no other choice but to stay with her tormentor. Even as recently as 2021, James Chiles and his pro-slavery legacy was making national headlines when leaders from Johnson County, Kansas, just a stone's throw over the border from Independence, sought to change the name of a local creek. Negro Creek, found on maps as early as 1856, ran right through Chiles' family property, and the story goes that the name derived from one of Jim Crow's escaped slaves who chose to end his own life right there in the creek rather than to return to bondage. The other story, just as gruesome, states that either Jim or his father chased after the slave and gunned him down as he was in the water. So I don't know, doesn't really sound like a nice guy. If you've ever seen the excellent movie Ride with the Devil, it looks like Jim Crow Chiles may have loosely inspired the character Jack Bull Chiles, or at least the name. That said, the movie version of Chiles, as portrayed by Skeet Ulrich, doesn't really seem to have much in common with the real-life Jim Crow, other than the two being from prominent families. Daniel Woodrell, the guy who wrote the novel that the movie's based on, Woe to Live On, does appear to have done a similar mix match of names with other real-life guerrillas as well. Thanks to the great David Lambert, I do have a link for the entire book available to read online for free in this episode's show notes. Disclaimer, I have not read it, but I would like to if I ever get the time, as I absolutely love that movie. Seriously, if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor. I put a short clip in the show notes as well if you'd like a little teaser. Check it out. And I think that's about all I've got on Jim Crow Chiles.